Why are you ducking, bro?
What's the difference between gender dysphoria and body dysmorphia? Do you know the difference?
Now we're getting somewhere. Hey, Destiny.
Hi.
Go ahead, Av.
It's okay if we walk me through the case real quick?
A guy is like, he feels comfortable in his body. He has no problem being a man or whatever, but he's thinking like, if I could transition to being a female, it would be so hot. I'd get tits, like the way my body would look. I would jerk off this shit every day. And then that person decides to trans for that reason. And then when they do that, it's just like, it's a fun experience for them. They enjoy it. They're okay with the transition. Will we consider that person trans?
To just clarifying question, is the motivating reason behind the transition is not a type of incongruency between one's gender and one's sex that either causes any discomfort or causes a lack of well-being, which I don't take to be the same thing, but we can get into that. The reason in this example is because of like a sexual type of fetish. They get some sort of... No, I wouldn't consider that person trans.
Okay, well, Pisco would.
Okay.
Wait.
Yeah.
But why are you ducking, bro?
Which one?
You're ducking, you know who.
Oh,
you don't
Abby?
You don't want to say the name.
I do, because they all come from the community that guy just came from. That's exactly that community.
Wait, really?
Yes, they're all part of the same community. Yes.
No, but he's different. I've heard him. Wait. Fuck. I've heard him argue vaccine people. He did a really good job.
Who, Dr. Abby?
Dr. Abby. Yeah.
No, hold on. Dr. Abby's a cool dude. I've never heard him say anything weird, but he's like part of this community. He's a generally cool dude. He doesn't do like, generally, I don't think any other crazy
guilt by association.
Basically, yeah. Yeah.
Remember that guy?
Yeah, Jesus Christ, I do, yeah. But like if a blood came to my house and he wanted to ask me to like hang out and I was like, I'm sorry, bro. And it's like, we don't have to do any gang shit. And I'm like, yeah, I just don't feel safe. I would go by association. I'd say, sorry, bro. Not today.
I just want to be clear. In the chat, Ains, who's always adding me with fucking venom.
Call out.
He's like, but when you actually got to the facts of the case, you were wrong. I came in here, right? First of all, I don't know shit about
Okay, hold on. Pisco's about to cope. Pisco came in here because he saw Dan was against me, and Pisco was like, I'm going to go anti-jerk Steve, and I'm going to go and help Danny.
You were just wrong. You were just wrong.
I wasn't wrong. Hassan is... Here is my original point that I stand by 100%. Hassan is a fucking retard for being like, oh, I can't believe you DMCA'd me. This is so obviously wrong. Hassan is the one with a ton of confidence. There's nothing surprising about Aiden DMCA'ing him. It was his fucking stream, and Hassan ripped the stream like 100%.
I thought Dan was just saying that it's
I don't know. He's trying to like make it seem like he's like, no, you can't DMCA. I never said that. I fucking said that the whole situation is very unknown when it comes to streaming in general. Never mind DMCAing people.
Okay,
it's
but
like
Dan,
no one knows how it works.
Like, Dan, it's very unknown what would happen if I were to inject bleach into your fucking fingernail, right?
No,
but that doesn't mean I can't.
That is not the same.
That's horse shit. Wait,
hold on.
No,
Pisco.
Here's why I would say unknown.
Pisco.
You don't know who owns the copyright for this stream. You actually don't know.
I do. I own it.
You think you do until fucking Tide Pod sues you and wins because you broadcast their shit without permission and fucking rapes you in court. And Pisco knows that there's a chance that could happen too.
Good one. Nice. True.
Bro, you see some of the rulings that are happening in this country over stuff?
No, which one suggests that your take here is correct?
Actually, you know what? I'm not gonna elaborate.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
I'm not gonna, but I do think on balance, probably Hassan has the worst argument. That's true.
There you go. Then we agree. Boom.
But to pretend, and I think this is Dan's point, I think it's a good one, to pretend that everything is so clear. No, it's not like that.
No, hold on. There's one thing that's clear. What's clear is that Aiden Ross could file a DMCA claim. That's almost for sure.
Anyone can sue anyone. Anyone can DMCA anyone. That means nothing.
Do you guys understand that? Wait. Hold on. You guys are acting fucking retarded, right? When I say like you could protect your house, and you're like, well, you could also jump off the Empire State Building. Yeah, you could. That's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that reasonably, I think there is a very high reason for Aiden to assume that he owns the copyright to his own fucking stream. Of course, Dan does. Dan does deny. Dan is.
I did not.
Dan is denying. Dan, shut up. We're talking about you right now. Dan is saying, oh, well, actually.
Hey, why is that my voice? Well, all right, I'm going to do your voice, so you do my voice like that. I'll do yours. Okay.
What Dan was saying, oh, actually, he has no fucking idea who owns the fucking copyright because Tide Pod could fucking sue him. That's what Dan was saying.
And then Steve was saying, Dan, that's not the case. I'm telling you, Aiden has a really good chance here of doing it, okay? So
and then Aiden
that is
came
the difference.
I'm sorry. Pisco came in and he said, I agree with Steven. Aiden does have a really good chance of winning this. Boom.
I do think so. But
oh my God.
Wait.
Oh my God.
They're at maximum cope right now. They're maximum cope.
I think Dan's point was like a little bit more modest than that.
No,
right?
it wasn't. It wasn't.
It was, but he's actually fucking brain dead. He just wants to try and win. His blind Hassan hatred like anything that can get him to possibly have Hassan wrong and him right is going to be
Even
like,
Crowder
illegal.
right, huh?
Yeah.
True. I was going into this to dick right Hassan because I hate Aiden. I figure Aiden's going to do some retarded shit. I figure Hassan probably knows copyright. I was trying to build up good credit with the left here by saying, like, oh, good faith I can be for Hassan. But then Hassan comes out here saying, like, well, obviously this is my copyright because I was on the stream. It's like, what? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life.
You just said the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. This isn't Hassan the person who like streamed kitchen drama or what kitchen nightmares?
Yeah.
And you thought he was going to have a good take on fair use and copyright?
Yeah, streamers know that that's illegal. We just don't give a fuck because nobody cares about it. That doesn't preclude you from having a good take on anything. My guess would be if Hassan got a copyright strike filed against him by the people that own the copyright to Master Chef, he'd probably like, oh, okay, well, fair's fair. That'd be my guess, unless he'd be like, I have a right to rebroadcast this.
Oh, all right. Damn, how you been?
Okay. Except for when Dan comes in to harass me about shit, but
I feel like Dan's the content man, and him and the Mutant streams were always my favorite.
Yeah.
Wow, that brings me back.
Really just fucking grinds my gears. I'm going to be $150 with you.
What's grinding them right now, Dan?
Well, though, all of it. I'm proper ground right now.
Okay.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a serious question?
Are you going to specify who you're talking to, or?
You, Steven.
Okay, yeah, what's up?
Do you really think that in order to be trans, you have to have dysphoria?
Why, Pisco? Why does listen? I'm a great fan of trans people, huge ally. But I would also think not every conversation on this stream every fucking day doesn't need to be about trans issues. Every day.
I agree.
And you're part of the problem right now doing this.
I agree. It doesn't always need to be about that, but you are ducking a conversation very openly, Steven, and it makes me embarrassed.
I'm not.
It makes me embarrassed.
Pisco, you're the last person that's going to goad me into this with this type of rhetoric. So number one, nice try. Okay, but number two, I don't avoid that conversation. I just like having it with the AY community.
But why?
I've had this conversation a million fucking times because I don't want anything tangentially to do with that community. They're gross to me. I just don't want anything to do with them. Do I not have that right? Why are you trying to debate rape me?
Never ever on any topic?
No, I just tend to stay away from them.
He's obviously scared.
He is.
Give me Avi's argument. What's so wrong? What's so wrong about saying you need dysphoria to be trans? You're making it sound like it's a ridiculous.
I'm gonna give you an example, right?
Yeah, give me an example.
Say that somebody, a person, never has dysphoria, except that hypothetical, all right? Never has whatever the DSM-5, whatever the definition of dysphoria is, this person does not have it.
Okay.
And this person transitions fully in the way that you would describe as fully. Medically, they have surgery, they take hormones, and now this person was a biological male, transitions into a transgender female without dysphoria.
Okay.
Are they trans?
I guess potentially they could be, yeah.
What do you mean they could be? They are, aren't they?
Okay, sure.
So you don't need dysphoria to be trans.
I think that there was probably some dysphoria that they didn't recognize.
No. Assume my hypothetical, the facts as I laid them out.
Could somebody theoretically be trans, and then they transition for no reason, and then you find out that
they prefer it. They prefer it, and it's not for related to dysphoria. They just want to be, for reasons unrelated to dysphoria.
Oh, sure. I would just call that really advanced cross-dressing.
Would you call it transgender?
No, I would call it really advanced cross-dressing.
Why not? They were one gender.
Because if they were comfortable with the gender they were before, but they like the aesthetics or something related to being a woman or whatever, then they can do that, I guess. If they want to cross-dress with surgery, they can do that. But
in every other physical respect, right? You've before said that I don't want to identify women based on, like things that we don't use to verify whether or not they're actually women in the real world, like looking at their genome or whatever. So in this case, you have someone who has fully transitioned, has no dysphoria, and is similar to someone who had dysphoria, whose transition cured that dysphoria or treated that dysphoria. And at the end result is these two people, the only difference is historically one had dysphoria and one didn't. And you would say one is trans and one is not, even though in all other respects, right?
The example is really hard to compute. Like, what is your definition? Is your definition of trans here just a person who is happier after surgery than before?
No, it would include, so I would say a transgender person is either someone who has dysphoria and is and has the kind of mental state, the fact of the matter you're referencing, or someone who wants to transition and does. Surely it must include that.
I guess maybe there might be some like edge case trans person here that qualifies under that. I don't know if I'm interested in talking about this case like 99% of the time, but I theoretically, I guess what you're talking about could be true.
What do you mean could be?
Just what I said. What part of could be true doesn't? Are you not computing right now?
On your vision of transness before, you said that would not that example should not fly, because you said in order to be trans you have to have dysphoria. If it is the case that it could be the case that those people are trans notwithstanding not having dysphoria, then it would be the case that your definition that you need to have dysphoria to be trans would be wrong. If it could be the case,
I guess I don't see somebody as being like whatever in their gender, and then they want to go through all the surgeries and everything else to be a different gender, and they didn't have some kind of dysphoria before. I think I would just call that. Yeah, I would just call that advanced cross-dressing. It's just super advanced cross-dressing because because you're born a man. You're a man. What do you mean? But like you think you could have more fun as a woman or whatever? That's like.
So then it isn't the case that it could be that they're trans. It would be they're absolutely not trans.
I mean, I guess you theoretically you could be trans and not realize it. Is that what we're talking about for the dysphoria thing?
This is all theoretical because it's hypothetical. So you don't need to use words like theoretical or hypothetically or I guess. We're operating in a space of perfect information, and you have a definition that is, or a condition which is, if you don't have dysphoria, then you are not trans.
If you are a trans person, I believe there should probably be some discomfort that's caused with the mismatch between brain and body. If there's no
should be
like if you're in a woman's body and your brain genuinely feels like you're a man, and there's like a mismatch there, that should cause some feelings of discomfort. If there's no discomfort there, then you're probably fine being a man or a woman. I don't think you're.
Don't you think the best definition of transgender is someone who transitions?
No, absolutely not. That's probably the worst definition of transgender.
Don't you think it should include someone who transitions?
No, absolutely not. If I forcibly transition somebody, are they now trans? Absolutely not.
One second.
Oh God, Abby's like typing with you. Now we're doing proxy debates. Oh God. It's Irk. I saw what you typed in chat earlier. I'm pretty sure what 99% of this debate is it generally boils down to people get mad because they think that the definition for gender dysphoria is too medically restrictive. So then they feel like in order to get around that medically restrictive term, they just want to argue that dysphoria has absolutely nothing to do with being trans. But,
no one's saying it has nothing to do with it, but wouldn't...
Well, no, they're saying it's not a requirement at all. But if you're somebody who's like, oh yeah, I'm a man, I'm chill being a man. I think I'd like being a woman more though. That's like, you're on some hardcore AGP... like cross-dressing thing there with your body. That's like, in my mind, that's like a fundamentally different thing.
But if you fully medically transition, why shouldn't we consider you to be trans?
Whether or not you medically transition has
you're
nothing
literally you're transitioning from one gender to another.
That is not what trans means.
Why shouldn't it include people who do that?
That's like such a weird definitional, like tautological win.
No,
if I go and I take a kid and I forcibly transition them, are they now trans under that definition? Would you say yes?
Good luck. Have fun.
Listen.
Well, no, wait, answer that question, because that's what you're saying. If somebody transitions, then they're trans.
I would think that the dysphoria felt on either side, right, for someone who is forcibly transitioned, right, that dysphoria would reassert them back to the initial gender. And so I would not...
So you'd call them trans while they're transitioned, but then when they would trans back, they would no longer be trans.
Hang on. To call them trans while they're transitioned?
Yeah.
No. I probably wouldn't call them trans because of the forcible nature of what they did. And just like I would call someone who is in the process of going into their new gender, I might call them trans because of the dysphoria they feel. Likewise, someone who has been forcibly changed because of the dysphoria they now feel, right? I might call them trans as well. Or sorry, not trans, even though, but this is one avenue, right? If you feel dysphoria on either side, I think there's a good argument that we should label you either trans or cis in the case of the forcibly transitioned.
I think that if you don't feel any dysphoria, then whatever you're doing essentially amounts to cosmetic surgeries, which you can do if you want to look a different way, but I would call you something different than transgender. The easiest thing I can think of right now is like is cross-dresser.
Wait, but it's useful though. It's a useful term.
It's not useful at all. It's, if anything, it's incredibly damaging.
Wait, why is it damaging?
Because the main impetus behind providing healthcare and resources to trans people is that they're living like almost unmanageable lives absent medical care. That they experience intense feelings of disgust. They've got problems with their body, relationships. Usually there's comorbidities, a bunch of other mental illness. If we start lumping in a bunch of people that are like, oh, like I'm really cool and happy being a man, but God, it'd be so cool to have fucking tits. Like that's they're fundamentally a different type of. That's a totally different type of experience that's going on there.
I think that you'd be right to say like most people present in the way that you're describing. That is to say, most people will have dysphoria and they'll transition to treat that dysphoria. But to the extent that if you're saying something like you need to have dysphoria in order for me to consider you trans, if there's a single case that you would consider to be trans that doesn't fit that, and I think in the case of someone who transitions because they want to, that would fit the bill, then what you're saying can't be true.
Okay, there might be a world then where I would say, okay, yeah, I guess this is a thing, but I would never talk about it and it's not relevant to any of the conversations that are going on. And giving it too much air is probably incredibly harmful to actual trans people. Because then all you set up now is a society where parents are constantly thinking like, oh, you're just one of those people that like, you think you want to be a woman, but like you're fine a man, you'll be okay. Like trans people are totally cool in their own genders as well. Like that type of trans person to me is fundamentally different than somebody with intense dysphoria. Or maybe
you're now making a separate claim that anyone who's espousing that as an argument is doing harm themselves. Well, I mean, you could
what you're saying
narrative from intuition the other way around too, which is
how
you
no because in my world no hold on. In my world where I impose on these quote unquote non-dysphoric trans people, hey, there probably shouldn't be private access there probably shouldn't be like medical insurance and stuff that covers these surgeries. They're fine. They don't have dysphoria. They'll be okay. There's no harm there.
You're not real. So you're spinning a story from intuition, which is me saying that certain trans people might not have dysphoria is harmful, but that's a story from intuition that you can tell. I'm not going to say that you prove it with data, but I could spin a narrative that said you imposing the requirement that people be dysphoric is causing other people to scrutinize heavily people who purport to want to transition, and that's causing harm for other reasons. We can both spin stories.
I'm fine with that. I'm okay with that. There should be heavy scrutiny, especially with children. Surgeries.
Hang on. Assume adults for now. Is that okay, or do you need the children?
Okay, we can assume adults for now, but the scrutiny is still important. Because we're talking about things like insurances, public or private, covering it, which kind of affects everybody. And we're talking about people like, I think there's probably some surgeries that should be pretty heavily gate-kept, I would say. Right? Like if somebody goes into the conservative argument, like if somebody says, I really want my leg cut off, you probably shouldn't be able to go into a hospital because your leg cut off because it makes you feel better, right? So there should be a high degree of scrutiny around trans stuff, right? It's a very rare thing. It's not 20% of the fucking population. And there should be some hoops you have to jump through, like any medical diagnosis, even for SSRIs or fucking amphetamines, like you've got to go through some process, and these drugs have a lot less of a permanent effect than other things, right? I think that's okay for it to be gate-kept a little bit, and there to be a high degree of scrutiny. That's fine.
Would it surprise you if trans people thought that was not helpful?
The problem there is we have to start breaking out when you said trans people, because most of them online, I don't even know if they're really trans anymore. I don't know if I believe that. So that's like a fundamentally different type of thing.
Trans people, how you would define trans people?
How anybody would define trans people.
No, I'm asking, do you think it's possible that trans people think that what you're offering, which is that you think there should be greater restrictions?
I never said there should be greater restrictions. I'm just saying there should be a high degree of scrutiny.
What does that look like?
As in when somebody comes in, there's some battery of tests, or there's some way that you ascertain the mental state of a person to figure out if they're actually trans or if they're not actually trans. And if they are, then you proceed with some treatment to help alleviate their symptoms. And if they're not, then you figure out what else is wrong.
And if they say, if the doctor says something to like, I don't think that you're suffering dysphoria, therefore you are not cleared for for gender reassignment, you would be like, that's the world I want.
Yes, that's part of figuring out what a medical diagnosis is that can help you. Yeah, if a person goes into a thing, they're like, I think I have ADHD, and then they talk to the therapist for a while, and the therapist's like, I really don't think you do have ADHD, and they've got other problems going on. I'd rather a world where they're like critically analyzing the patient than just like relentlessly giving them drugs. We'd probably say the same for painkillers, right? Do you think that a doctor should be in charge of figuring out if a patient has pain or not before prescribing opiates?
I think they should, yes.
Okay, even though there's a world where some people are probably going in and genuinely having, because you just said that, well, what about women and black people? They get fucked over hard on that type of scrutiny. Because you can argue that there's some, well, not argue, I'm pretty sure it's borne out in the data, they've got hard, right? But you wouldn't say, well, hold on, okay, well, no more scrutiny for painkillers because some groups of people are adversely affected by the scrutiny here, right? You'd say, well, we should probably change the scrutiny a bit. But you'd want to gatekeep access to those. And things like hormones, like HRT and TRT and shit, probably a little bit more serious than painkillers, arguably, depending. But
yeah, I'm not sure if I think that you should require I'm someone who thinks that the drug war has been a big waste of time and money. And so I'm not sure if I think, I think recreational drugs should be largely legal in this country and taxed.
Hold on.
And so
recreational drugs being, hold on. You're, okay, wait. Let's take a moment.
Including...
No. You're super debate brewing right now. That was the most retarded thing I've ever seen in the world. Recreational drugs being legal is a far cry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
From going to the hospital and having a doctor prescribe you opiates for abuse, right?
I was foreseeing the I didn't complete the circuit.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
So my argument was like, if I'm in favor of making recreational drugs legal for everyone, regardless of whether or not you quote unquote need like weed for pain or anything, then I'm not so sure that I would say that you require a doctor's script to get prescribed a painkiller. I'm not so sure that I'd be in that camp, because I think that's partly contributing to the opioid pandemic that we have now, which is people, because of restrictions and because of pricing, are turning to fentanyl, and it's killing hundreds of thousands of people a year.
Okay, I'm actually super curious. Here's a question. Do you think that, and this is a hard one, I actually don't have an answer to this. Should people be allowed to self-mutilate if they do it in like a safe environment? You could argue to some extent this happens with like extreme forms of body modifications or tattoos if you want help, but I'm curious
Themselves?
What you think. Yeah. Or even having a shop that does it. You go to a shop and then they're like, we're going to cut your ring finger kind of in half so you have 6 fingers. Like, should that be a thing that is allowed to be done? And then the next question would be like, what if somebody wants to cut off a leg and they go to a shop and they pay them to do that? It's an adult.
Yeah. And then what about to kill you, right?
No, you don't have to go to the kill you, because trans people aren't trying to kill themselves with drugs, but it's just kind of like a form of extreme body modification.
I'm not saying that the analogy extends that far, but I'm saying, wouldn't you be okay with, do you think people have the right to kill themselves? And then I can work backwards.
Yeah, I guess we can, sure. As long as we have to knock out the easy examples for like extreme like medical fucking shit or whatever.
I also think that people should be allowed to kill themselves. And so I don't know, other than my personal disgust, and maybe you can find a way to distinguish it, other than my personal disgust, or if it were institutionalized and taxed, maybe I'd be fearful of the incentives on these businesses who are making profit off of it. So maybe there'd be a reason why I wouldn't want that to be commercialized for other reasons. But don't you agree in principle, if you have the right to kill yourself, why wouldn't you have the right to mutilate yourself?
I think for an adult, I think you probably should have the right to do whatever you want. But I think that when we start talking about like insurances, like covering it and everything, like because a lot of the arguments for a lot of these things come down to like mandatory coverages, for instance. Like, so for instance, for abortion, one of the big things is, do you remember when Hobby Lobby had the big fight over whether or not their private insurance group had to cover abortion? Yep. Yeah. So I think that I feel like that would be the next stage of the fight is, let's say, okay, fine. If anybody wants to get drugs and be trans and do all that, that's fine. But then a whole bunch of insurance groups are like, well, we're not going to cover this. Would there be like a federal protection that's called there for protected classes or whatever?
Yeah, I think that you can make a good argument that insurance shouldn't cover these elective destructive procedures, and I don't.
Well, hold on. So like what you just said there, that was a loaded word. Elective destructive procedures. I would consider SRS for an actual trans person. I wouldn't consider that destructive. I would say that would be important surgery, right?
I'm not applying to drugs or trans related drugs that are used for gender affirming whatever, right? I'm just applying it to I'm interested by your body mutilation hypotheticals, and I'm going on them, and I think that you could find a reason to distinguish giving benefits and encouraging these kinds of things and commercializing them and still maintain the right to do it. And so it seems like you're okay with it being legal to mutilate yourself.
Being legal to mutilate yourself, Okay, tell me if you have an answer for this, because this is a catch-22 that was always hard. Okay. Do you think that here's a strange catch-22. You should be allowed to go into a hospital to have a doctor help you commit suicide. However, you have to be of sound mind in order for the doctor to do it. But how do you evaluate sound mindness of a person who's suicidal? What is the answer to that conundrum? I've never heard a good...
I don't have one right now off the top of my head.
Because I think that would be similar to the trans question. It's like, well, if a person wants to go in and do whatever to their body, should they be able to? And because I think you and I would probably agree that in some cases, if a person wants to go in and do crazy shit to their body or whatever, like, fuck it. Like, maybe they should be allowed to. But, like, let's say it's the case that a guy, like, say you got, like, the hand cutting shop or whatever. Let's say that a guy just gets divorced or his kid dies in a car accident and he's like, fuck this. Like, my life is, I'm just going to get my hands cut off. I'm going to go and do this surgery or whatever. We probably say, well, maybe there should be, like, a stop or a check for this guy. Like, I don't know if we want these services like super readily available.
Okay, that's fine. But the whole reason we're here, just to unwind it a little bit, is you said there's reasons why it's important to have this definitional distinction where we're talking about dysphoria as a prerequisite to transness, because if we don't heavily scrutinize it, then people are just going to go willy-nilly and do this kind of thing. I just don't know, is that a huge fear of yours? And if at the end of the road you would allow people to just do what they want anyway, just maybe not fund it, why does it matter then? Why do you have a problem definitionally?
Well, I think definitionally...
okay, there could be some trans people who don't have dysphoria.
Yeah, I think definitionally it matters because we seem to have a really hard time right now having a consistent and stable definition for what trans is. And I feel like right now in the United States, the self-ID thing is taken over, which no sane, reasonable person, not you nor Avi, I think, agrees with, right? You wouldn't agree that... Okay, yeah. You can't be a thing because you say you're a thing. It's tautologically meaningless. It's absolutely ridiculous, right?
I do not agree with that. But I do want to say, your definition of trans to just mean dysphoria, that is useless. Then you just have two words that are...
Wait, hold on. That's wait. That's not useless. It's diagnostic criteria for disease. How is it useless?
So, to be trans, is it equal to being dysphoric, or is it more than that?
That essentially a person with dysphoria will... or a person who is trans will likely have dysphoria, yes.
Who are the people who have dysphoria and are not trans?
I mean, I'm sure we could imagine some forms of like body dysmorphia, people that feel like
gender dysmorphia, sorry.
This gender dysphoria and aren't trans.
Sorry, my bad.
Yeah, I guess it could be the case. Like maybe like a woman that gets like a mastectomy after a surgery feels like her body is not good because she's lost her breasts or something.
So the category of gender dysphoria includes things that trans doesn't include, right?
The gender people can be gender dysphoric without necessarily being
trans, right? And so my position would just be extended out the other way. People can be trans without necessarily being dysphoric, just having dysphoria. That's the symmetry I'm looking for.
But then I can't compute the idea that you are born in a body whose gender expression doesn't match your identity, your body doesn't match your brain, but it like doesn't bother you that much. It seems like you're probably not trans then. But I just can't imagine that trans is trans.
Not if trans is relating to something about what you're putting your body through, right? If trans is relating to how you're presenting yourself to the world and changes you're making to your body, which I think it should be, because I think if that tells us more at a glance what a trans person is. You don't necessarily know someone's history, right? At the end of the day, you might have a trans person to you, Stephen, right? Who looks indistinguishable from another trans person, let's say. And for one, you just happen to know their history. For the other one, you don't know their history. Should we treat them differently? Should we use a different word, even though...
Wait, I don't understand what is the comparison here, right? So we're talking about treating people differently based on what they look like or whatever. I don't understand.
Labeling people differently, right? If you have someone who is willing, who at the time they were born, presented and did everything associated with male, and changed at T=2 to present and behave as female, I think that is a good grounds for calling someone trans. And you wouldn't necessarily...
So if somebody just changes their gender presentation, then they are trans at that point?
In a way, I think that's more permanent, I think, is what trans is envisioning, right?
So if tomorrow I started wearing a dress, shaving my legs, and I up-pitch my voice, am I now trans? Well, because it sounds like what you're saying. I'm trying to understand.
If you are making efforts that people will perceive, and that people are perceiving you that you're doing that way, Otherwise we're saying that it's required for you to have a particular procedure to be trans, and I don't think that you would accept that.
Okay, let's let me.
definition.
I'll draw this out. Okay, this is what I'm thinking. Okay, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, this is kind of how I view things. All right, there's going to be a big spectrum in our brains of like of we'll say female to male. All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Sorry, I didn't see the line until just now.
that's okay. All right. There's gonna be a big gender spectrum on the in the brain of like female to male. Some people probably feel like ultra male. Okay. Some people feel pretty male. Some people are kind of maybe close to androgynous or whatever. But like generally, we kind of have like this is where our brains are at, right? Now, if it's the case that your body, okay, is sexed differently than your brain, for however this works, right? We still don't 100% understand. But if it's the case that you're sexed differently, right? That your mind is way more sexed in the male direction and your body is sexed in the female direction, or vice versa, I would imagine that if that condition is met, a dysphoria will arise from that. If it's sexed differently, I don't know if it's possible for a person to just not care or to not be that concerned with it. I feel like those are exclusionary things to me. That'd be my guess. Unless you're so close to androgynous on like both your body and your mind, where you've got a brain that's like barely female and then a body that's like barely male.
This is a beautiful hypothetical.
Okay.
Let's put you right dead set in the middle.
Sure. So you're just very androgynous. You have a very androgynous brain. Sure.
Brain, right? This is the brain, right? That you're putting on the spectrum.
Yeah.
If you're dead set in the middle, but let's say, I don't want to have to deal with people being like you're androgynous. I want to pick one, right? And I might even flip a coin, right? I might even flip a coin to see where it lands. That's how indifferent I am. Okay?
Well, but the statement that you've already made, I would say precludes you from indifference. If you're saying I'm tired of being perceived as androgynous, then
I'm indifferent between the two ends of the spectrum, the two polarities. I want to pick one of those tendencies. That is to say, I want to be perceived 99% as either male or 99% as female. You follow me?
Okay.
I'm not indifferent between being androgynous and not being androgynous, but I'm indifferent between being male or female. Does that make sense? As a hypothetical? Not that you conceive of that.
I don't know. I don't know if even for hypothetical, I don't know if I can see someone who's indifferent.
No, you can. Stop. You can. You
okay,
can.
Okay.
You just,
let me ask a
you put the
contrapositive.
spectrum.
Wait,
no.
Oh God.
No, hang on.
The problem is if I grant you this, it's your whole argument, right? I can't conceive of a person that just doesn't care. But if I say, well, yeah, this person could exist, then your whole argument is laid out. Well, of course, they don't give a fuck and they would be happy. But I don't think I don't know if those people
you can't
exist.
Conceive of someone you can't conceive of someone who doesn't feel strongly male or female. You've described yourself as such.
Wait, no. Hold on. As somebody that both doesn't feel strongly about it, but would be happier if they 99%ed one way or the other. Those are the two things you meant. I don't think those two things can exist.
Okay, you don't have to think it. You think it's impossible to exist. That's fine. For the purpose of this hypothetical, you can accept the facts or you can just not engage in the hypothetical. That's your choice.
Good. Here's a
You're
question.
You're going to say, wait. Are you just not going to engage in the hypothetical because you think the facts are so preposterously, but you'll engage in the sniper hypotheticals. You'll engage in the, whatever hypotheticals you want.
If I engage in the hypothetical, the rest of the argument lays itself out. Oh, well, here you got a person who doesn't experience any gender dysphoria, but they'd be happy they presented on the extreme end of the spectrum, even though they were indifferent to being in the middle, and then boom, there you go. You have a choice. But I don't believe those people exist. But if I grant you the hypothetical that person exists, well, then the rest of your argument is automatically laid itself out for it, right?
Okay, so now you have a whole group of people who are telling you that they don't feel strongly one way or the other, and they call themselves non-binary, and you're telling me you don't think that they're real, right? You think
I don't think that that's the non. First of all, I don't even know how I feel about non-binary, but
there are people who are saying this is true of them.
Sure.
There are people who profess to be neither strongly male nor strongly female.
But typically they stay away from ultra-gendered expressions.
A non-binary
person doesn't say, I want to go and be ultra-femme or ultra-masc. Usually they go for some androgynous thing.
Whether or not they typically do something, the people that I'm describing that you've put out the spectrum that I'm accepting for the purpose of this discussion of having quote unquote non-binary brains, they are saying that they exist, and it could be the case that one of these people, one day without feeling dysphoria says, I want to medically transition to have more, away from the gender I was born with or assigned at birth. That person, I think it would make sense to characterize them as trans. Just as a definitional thing, because I think trans relates to having a gender expression that's different than the one where you were born with and assigned at birth. That's what I think the core of trans means. And I think the core of dysphoria means something else. The core of dysphoria has to do with your mental states. And the core of trans has to do with like what you are presenting to the world. And I don't think it's wrong at all. And I don't think it makes the definition useless. And I don't think it marries you to a self-ID perspective, which I don't have.
It doesn't marry you to self-ID perspective, but I think it's just...
What's wrong about it?
Because that group of people they're so different than the other group of people. A person who's like, I'm gonna kill myself because I hate my body so much because I'm male presenting and I feel like I need to be female. You're saying that person, it falls under the same umbrella as a person who's like, yeah, I'm male and it's kind of cool or whatever, but like, damn, it'd be super cool if I was female. Like these two people are having a fundamentally different experience.
Yeah, trans people can have different experiences.
No. Yeah, and cancer patients can have different experiences, but we say a person with a cold is a person with cancer.
Okay,
Obviously, everybody can have a different experience, but like when we say trans, we want it to mean something.
Example. That's a great example, right? Mm-hmm. That's a beautiful example. We have some medical definitions for what cancer is, and let's assume that definition has to do with a size of a tumor, the number of cells, or whatever that a doctor would pick up and perceive as a tumor. Mm-hmm. If that's the definition, right? There can be cancer patients who, you never even know you have cancer, or they have totally different challenges than other cancer patients. But that's okay, because what the essence of what the cancer definition is getting at has to do with these cells, these tumors, but not with anything else.
You have to compare it with a different other thing, because the problem with cancer is not a state of mind, right?
Okay.
And the issue is that cancer is something that you can measure in the body, right?
Athletes, right? The core of that term is reflecting some kind of, I don't know, physical activity related to sport, right? And that term encompasses a lot of different broad categories of things, and athletes could have very different challenges. The challenges related to the women's U.S. soccer team are different than the challenges of CTE in American football, right? But notwithstanding that, we wouldn't say, well, let's just make athlete, because their experiences are so different, let's make athlete mean whatever the majority experience is. I think we're trying to preserve what the word means.
It's such an unbelievably different...
no, it's not. Come on. You're blowing out of proportion. The trans definition I'm arguing for.
If athlete was a term that conferred upon you some rights to some sort of medical thing, then we would actually be fighting over what it means. Let's say that athlete, if you're considered in the United States to be an athlete, let's say that you've got advanced access to certain types of medical treatments in the United States. I bet we'd be fighting a lot over whether or not people that were esports athletes were actual athletes then, because who knows if they should be entitled to the same types of medical treatments, right? We would be fighting over it. But right now, athlete doesn't confer on you anything special. It doesn't mean anything. It's not even important that we recognize what athlete means. People argue all the time over if somebody that plays fucking racquetball or tennis is not a real athlete. I remember you used to fight over this in high school for footballers, right? Or is somebody that mountain climbs, is that an athlete? If you're a rock climber,
okay,
right?
If that's
but it doesn't matter what they this, at the end of the day, these are inconsequential terms. Who the fuck cares what the definition of an athlete is? It doesn't mean anything.
I think that it's just an example to show that you don't necessarily change the meaning of a word because you think it's going to have good or different results. You just have more specified terms, more specific terms that refers to the subset you want to. And I think the essence of what people mean when they say trans has to do with how that person is trying to be perceived and is being perceived by the people around them.
Well, hold on,
wait. Have to do this.
I reject it. I'm sorry, just the very first sentence.
Okay.
We literally make classifications and designations just because of what we're trying to achieve with them. There's a reason why we make these things. There's a reason why we have categories called athletes, because they help us organize and understand the world. We don't just do these randomly.
But I would argue to you that the category of trans includes people who've transitioned.
No,
that's
hold
already
on. Wait, you already
most people would agree to. When I'm arguing about the meaning of a word, I'm usually referring to its ordinary public meaning. So, when people refer to trans people, I think they're including anyone who medically transitions, at least voluntarily. I'll say that's a good hypothetical you have.
What if somebody is incorrect about an underlying fact of matter for even if they were trans and they had another problem and they thought transitioning would help and then they trans? Is that person now trans?
In a specific case, who's wrong about a fact of the matter?
The person who thinks they're trans isn't actually. They just have depression or anxiety or something, and they find a community and they decide to transition. And fuck it.
So how I could apply that is, suppose that someone has medically transitioned, but now wants to go back, right? At the time that they want to go back, are they still trans?
Well, no, they were never trans. If you're going to say this, then that means that a person who transes themselves and is now trans is no longer trans at all, because now they're trans to now they're the gender they identify as.
Right. So you're saying that you can only ever be trans So you're assigned trans at birth?
Yes, or not by birth, but like through development, basically.
What if
yeah.
it's not? What if that's not the? I mean, okay.
Well, if it's not, then I'm wrong. But I mean, like all the neurology
Then
and
no
everything is on
trans. Then no trans people exist. If
that
it's
could be
not-
the case. That might be the case. I don't know. This is just
That's not how people talk. That's not how people talk. People.
Well,
I
no,
think,
wait,
are
we're not talking.
referring-
Hold on, you're asking. You're jumping around 50 million different conversation topics. How people talk is another thing versus like, are trans people a real thing?
I don't think that's what people use the word trans to refer to.
Nobody know. Everybody's referring to different shit right now when they're saying trans. If you want, we can iron out like definitions for what we mean when we say trans. But like, you can't just like immediately appeal to like common vernacular. Like there is a common vernacular because we just said in here. Like some people think self-ID is trans. Some people, you've got a definition for trans. Like we're arguing about what we think the definition for trans should be. But
Okay, so on your reading, on your, I don't know, on your version of the word trans, a necessary condition for being trans is having dysphoria.
yeah, that would arise from the mismatch necessarily.
And
if your
someone
mismatch
who-
doesn't cause us dysphoria, then it's just you've got like a desire to like basically cross-dress or something. It's something different than that.
So if that's the case, granted my hypothetical, so if that's still your definition, it is the case that this person in the middle of the female-male brain spectrum that you've laid out, that person, were they to, flip a coin and pick the gender that wasn't the one they were assigned at birth, that person, despite going through all those medical treatments, despite having life-altering surgery, despite ingesting all manner of hormones and completely shaping and shifting how they present themselves to the world, and as such that everyone will recognize that person is presenting as female, that person is not trans. Because
Correct. Just
they didn't
transitioning
have
has
enough-
nothing to do with making you trans. Yeah.
The transitioning is not a sufficient condition to be trans.
What has nothing to do with being trans?
Transition has nothing to do with being trans.
Yes.
So if transition has nothing to do with being trans, why isn't gender dysphoria enough to be trans?
That's
Why aren't
wait. I
every
thought that's
trans-
what I said. It is. I thought I would consider that like if you have gender dysphoria, you're a trans person. Yeah.
But you gave it examples of when that's not true.
What was the example that I gave?
If someone had to have a mastectomy and they're experiencing gender dysphoria.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. There you go.
Okay.
So there would be other things that would go along as
What
well.
other things other than transitioning?
Not transition is not a symptom.
No. So sorry. You said that dysphoria is a necessary condition for someone being trans, but it's not necessarily a sufficient one, correct?
Sure.
Because if it were a sufficient one, then everyone who has dysphoria would be trans.
Well, it seems
Fair.
like the only people that I can think of, unless you give me a box, the only people that I can think of that would have dysphoria that aren't trans are people that have had some sort of like gender destructive thing happen to them. So for instance, like the easiest one I can think of is a woman with breast cancer getting a mastectomy. Or perhaps a man getting a fucking penile cancer or something. Like the only things that I can think of that would give you dysphoria are things that would attack your.
Okay, but then those cases you would agree are gender dysphoria, right?
I don't know if they're used that way. I'm trying to. It feels like that's. Those cases, gender dysphoria. What's the difference between gender dysphoria and body dysmorphia? Do you know the difference?
Now we're getting somewhere. Hey, Destiny.
Hi.
Go ahead, Av.
It's okay if we talk with the vegan debate ninja assassin is here.
Go for it.
I think so. I think a couple of things that you two should clear up. One thing is, I would clear up if you mean the same thing by gender incongruency and gender dysphoria. Are those just synonyms? On your view?
I believe if you're trans, I think they're essentially synonyms. The dysphoria arises from the incongruency. If the incongruency is such that you don't experience any dysphoria, then it's probably nothing that's worth. Like we all probably experience some sort of incongruencies every now and then. Like I don't think that arises to the
So
level
they're
of being
different.
trans.
So the answer is they're different.
Thank you.
Right, so it's important because the reason it's important is because it's when gender incongruency rises to the level of a diagnosable mental illness. Standardly, that's when it's used to describe gender dysphoria. So you'd have to have certain criteria, one of which being it has to be present for 6 months. That's why it's there for other conditions like schizophrenia and whatnot. It also has to be the case that it interferes with your job or day-to-day living or whatnot. That's a common theme in mental illness. But that doesn't mean it's like no big deal if you don't have gender dysphoria. You can be sad about it. You can have a persistent like dysthymia. But as long as you're able to do your daily functions,
Sure, but now we're going by dysphoria as it exists in the DSM-5, which is what I was saying earlier, is that I'm pretty sure people are fighting over the dysphoria thing because they think the DSM-5 might too harshly grade what dysphoria is, and your particular symptoms might not rise to it.
Yeah. That's just why I'm asking how
so there's
you're
probably,
using it.
I can imagine somebody having gender dysphoria, or I can imagine somebody having major depressive disorder where maybe it doesn't necessarily rise to exactly meet the criteria of what's laid out in the DSM, right? Or maybe somebody is actually a paranoid schizophrenic, but they can't actually hit enough of the DSM-5 criteria to get the diagnosis, perhaps, right?
Yeah. So I'm just asking you if, on your terms, like, would you consider those cases? Are you including that in your usage of dysphoria?
Yeah.
Then that's just, you shouldn't use the word gender dysphoria. Then you're using it in a way that people are hearing you say gender dysphoria, and they're hearing you the way anyone would hear you say gender dysphoria. That is to point to a specific clinical meaning, right?
You're absolutely fucking retarded if you think that the vast majority of people online are using a word. Nobody does that. No.
You're referring to gender dysphoria. When you say gender dysphoria, it's a catch-all for any gender incongruence.
Yes, not gender incongruence. Common parlance is gender dysphoria is talking about the intense discomfort that arises between the incongruence. It's like, that would be like saying, well, do you have depression? And then, well, Destiny, everybody knows that when you say depression, you're referring to the 7 bullet points under the DSM-5. That's not how people use that word. That's not true. Same thing with gender dysphoria.
So how about so you just said intense?
Yeah.
And how about moderate? People who have moderate.
No, not moderate. Only intense. If you have moderate, suck it up. You're not trans. You just got other problems.
That's silly.
No, what Silly is saying. No, hold on. What Silly is saying. I'm actually kind of chill. I think I'm cool being a man. Man, being a female would be super rad though. And then I'm gonna go get surgery to do that. And like, oh, cool. I was trans. That's ridiculous to me.
No. When you surely transitioning and going through those steps by itself, right? Going through all those steps intentionally, purposefully, whether for pain or potential pleasure that you're seeking, once you've achieved that, once you've gone through those states and gone through those procedures, I think most people would consider you to be trans. And I think the trans definition is getting at how you're either are presenting yourself to the world or you're trying to present yourself to the world. And if you are doing it in such a way that 99% of people would consider you to be trans if they looked at you or if they knew about.
I don't even know if 99% of people consider actual trans people to be trans. Conservatives, a lot of conservatives don't even think trans people are real at all. So I don't know what you mean.
Well, conservative people may not think any trans people are trans, but like, I think what Pisco's trying to capture is not part of that community. He's trying to capture some like Western liberal society type of community.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, like, I think there's two different goals here. Like, one goal is to say, okay, this is a definition, and our goal is to capture public meaning within a certain space. And I think Destiny's goal here is to say, well, I want to use this term because I care about how resources are allocated, and I want them to be allocated for meaningful purposes, aka a certain degree of suffering. Would that be fair?
Probably, or some meaningfully, yeah, because it feels like this definition of trans basically, like, theoretically, it would encapsulate like people that are purely like just AGP, like, and don't even feel trans. Like, what if you have a guy who's like totally cis, but he like super gets off on the idea of being a woman, and then he transitions just for that, and he's actually happier for it. Like Pisco, in your world, or I guess Ivy too, do you guys consider that person trans? Okay, yeah. Interesting.
Well, I just want to be clear about it because I don't know all the acronyms they use. So just walk me through the case real quick.
A guy is like, he feels comfortable in his body. He has no problem being a man or whatever, but he's thinking like, if I could transition to being a female, it would be so hot. I'd get tits, like the way my body would look. I would jerk off this shit every day. And then that person decides to trans for that reason. And then when they do that, it's just like, it's a fun experience for them. They enjoy it. They're okay with the transition. Will we consider that person trans?
To just clarifying question, is the motivating reason behind the transition is not a type of incongruency between one's gender and one's sex that either causes any discomfort or causes a lack of well-being, which I don't take to be the same thing, but we can get into that. The reason in this example is because of like a sexual type of fetish.
Yes.
They get some sort of... No, I wouldn't consider that person trans.
Okay, well, Pisco would.
Okay.
Wait.
Yeah. But hold on. But wait, that doesn't mean we agree. Okay, so we have three different views.
Don't worry.
But hold on. Yeah. Okay, but the point here, but I can give you another example where you probably, Pisco and I would agree and you wouldn't.
Okay, hit me up.
Yeah. So like, let's say we have an individual who is not feeling any suffering from their gender incongruency. So they're like at the neutral point, right? They're not like really happy about it, but they're not really sad about it. And then they transition in every way, and then they're very, very happy. They have this sense of well-being. But the source of the well-being, the origination, is not out of some sort of sexual fetish. It's out of a improved congruency between one's sex and one's gender. And that's causing some sort of gender euphoria for them. So they're not getting off or anything. They're not like jerking off to it.
How would a person like this even identify that they want to transition?
Why would it matter?
Why would it matter? Wait, hold on. What do you mean? Because do we want random people walking into the hospital, like fucking doing surgery to see if they? What do you mean? Why would it matter?
We're not having. So you're having a conversation about like, how is
we're not talking policy right now. We can talk about
talking about definitions and meanings, and you're fine debating those hypos when it's on your ground.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so then the question is, okay, so we're in the total hypothetical land. Could it be that there is a person who is totally?
Could it be? What would that person be if they did exist?
I'm not sure. I guess I could invent a new category of trans to like encapsulate this person, I guess.
Why wouldn't they, on your version of the words, not be encapsulated by the definition you have?
Because it's a fundamentally different experience than a person who's fine in their gender, but like maybe would have more fun as another gender. That's fundamentally different.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, we could grant that different trans people's have different trans people have fundamentally different experiences. I mean,
yeah, but but I wouldn't put this on the spectrum of like all the trans experiences. I would say this is like, it goes on a different spectrum. It's not on the same one as like from intense dysphoria to moderate dysphoria. Like I would say dysphoria is fundamentally different type of experience.
It's no dysphoria,
yeah,
but it's a lack of euphoria. It's like, okay, look, we can grant that there are certain conditions that like we treat certain things to prevent suffering. We also treat certain things to not as commonly, but we often do, to prevent deprivation of well-being. We do, and we want to do that in society. We don't want to keep people at the neutral point all day. We recognize that in society, people are generally more productive when they're
I mean, it really depends exactly on what we're talking about. You're a physician. When it comes to medicine, you do treat to the neutral point, and that's it. No, we treat to a target goal. Yeah, but the target, when I go to a hospital is not making me healthy. It's just making me not dying. Right? I don't go to the hospital to get a better diet. I don't go to the hospital to build muscle. I don't go to the hospital to build healthy routines. I go there for medicine and for surgery, essentially. That's what doctors essentially do, right?
Yeah, it's to a target point, and often on discharge of the hospital, you're not at the neutral point. You're still in the negative.
Sure, but I'm just saying
that,
like,
that,
typically
you go to a clinic outside, and then maybe you get to a neutral point, and then after that, you keep going, and then you do follow-ups, and then hopefully we can get you out past the neutral point into some positive well-being range.
Yeah, but that positive well-being range, typically like the medical system for hospitals don't typically like try to
not hospitals. Yeah, we have different categories of treatment for different. Yeah, like we're not going to take perfectly happy, healthy people and admit them into a hospital. Of course not. But that doesn't mean we don't treat them.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that like I'm not aware of, and you tell me if I'm wrong. Like I'm trying to think of like medical guidelines that are out that where you're prescribing drugs not to treat a condition or not do anything, but just to like make somebody really happy.
Yeah, sure. So let's say we have a woman who wouldn't be, would like to have sex without the risk of pregnancy, but wouldn't be that, depressed or anything if they just were abstinent. We still provide them with birth control pills.
Sure, but birth control pills, or we can think of like hysterectomies and stuff, aren't these things generally considered like elective procedures that aren't generally covered by...
Birth control pills are covered by insurance.
Birth control is, yes.
Yeah.
Do you know if are things like hysterectomies and the tubal litigation or whatever, are they generally...
Hysterectomy may, prior authorizations may vary depending on which insurance the patient has. But yeah, hysterectomies are covered by insurance as well, even on an elective basis.
Gotcha. Now, while this is true, and it might be a little bit cheating, obviously there's a lot of like contention around reproductive health. Outside of like the reproductive category, can you think of anything that where you kind of go to a hospital and they'll like try to put you above like baseline or above neutral? I agree for reproductive health. I think
because you're, so wait. So the reason why that doesn't work is because it has to do with reproduction.
Because I think that
the distinction without a difference. I don't know why would it matter.
Yeah.
Thank you for the contribution there. Because I think that when it comes to reproductive health, I think there is in a way like kind of a baseline being targeted here, which has to do with like not being pregnant, not like getting pregnant when you don't want to be, or sometimes avoiding like teen pregnancy, right?
Yeah, I can give another example. I mean, it's fine. I don't think I should have to, but I can.
Sure.
So insurance is commonly pay for a certain amount of therapy sessions, even if the patient is past the neutral point. Even if the psychiatrist or psychologist will determine that, okay, you are no longer depressed, you're not dysthymic, you're not really happy either, you're just at the neutral point. Insurance doesn't stop covering therapy sessions at that point.
Can you get recommended to a therapist if you don't have any like underlying like indications of anything? If you're just like at a hospital and you're like, I feel like it'd be cool to chat with a therapist, like maybe like, I feel pretty happy. But
if your affect is at like completely the neutral point, oh yeah.
Well, but hold on. I feel like it's an interesting word. When you say neutral affect, like the default for human, I don't think it's supposed to be
Eeyore, basically. Like just
but I mean, like that would be considered to most people that a neutral affect would be unhealthy. That wouldn't be like the neutral point for your affect should be like relatively happy, I think, right? Like that would be like.
But wait, now we're changing. Wait, but now that's changing what you've asked me, because you've asked me. You originally asked me, do we do that like? So this whole wait. So like, if I were to compare it to instance for like SSRIs, right? Like SSRIs are putting you to neutral, but they're not putting you at neutral. They're trying to make you somewhat happy because that's like the default state of human mind is a human mind that can like have desires and do things or whatever, right? But the goal of SSRIs isn't like, okay, we're gonna give you SSRIs so now you're like at a blunt affect and you're at a neutral affect. It's to put your brain up at a higher point, but that higher point is like a neutral point for a human, right? As a general healthy brain should be like what SSRIs are putting you up to. I think we're using the word neutral differently there. Okay, I see the confusion. I was using the word neutral as having no suffering or well-being. Like neither you're at a point where you're just not experiencing.
Okay, sorry, my bad. When I say neutral, I mean like neutral is like the ordinary and average state of a functioning healthy human body or whatever, essentially, right? Is what that's what I consider like neutral. I'm sorry, I should have clarified there. So okay. Like birth control helps you maintain like not being pregnant or whatever.
Okay, but then let's go back to the example then.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
Now that we cleared up our terms, so let's say we have a
maybe instead of neutral, I could say like baseline, like a human baseline or something. But yeah, go.
Yeah, so let's say, but then let's just go back to the example and put it into the terms as we understand them now. So because when I was using so to be clear, this individual who's transitioning, they're not at a neutral point in the sense of an average person. They're at the neutral point in the sense that they're not experiencing any well-being or suffering, or they're experiencing it to the same degree that they're literally at the neutral point, which is not where the average person.
Okay, for this person, could I not like, am I not allowed to say that if you experience absolutely no like attachment to your gender at all in any positive sense whatsoever, could that not be like a type of gender dysphoria? That if you have like if you like are completely blunted to that experience and you don't have any sort of like good feelings or happy feelings about being a man or whatever, if you are, is that not like a type of dysphoria?
I think that's defining away the problem.
Cool.
And you're just using.
You can't say that. What I'm trying to get at here is, are you including, when you say dysphoria, are you just saying that the person needs to have or experience a type of suffering when they have this gender incongruency in virtue of it?
Yeah.
Or are you going to include cases where they don't have suffering, but they have they're being prevented from having a normal amount of well-being?
Well, definitionally, is there a difference between the two things? Yeah, what's the difference?
So I can give you reasons why I take a lack of well-being and a lack of and why I consider well-being and suffering different things. And not just like two coins on the same spectrum. The first thing is they typically like typical reportings of well-being and suffering and certain experimental designs. They map onto different parts of the brain, giving us reasons to believe there's empirical reasons to believe they really are different things. It's also for pragmatic reasons. We also have, in terms of research, reason to classify them differently. But whichever way you slice it, I don't take those two things to be the same exact thing. On the same spectrum.
Could we argue then that like, so as a person that's very obese, but they're not experiencing, I guess, like any, or they've grown accustomed to or used to the obesity, are we saying that this person is not experiencing any suffering? It's just a lack of well-being, or how would you classify that?
In terms of, well, I mean, like, are we wanting away all the risks of obesity or the health risks that?
Yeah, like assume that like at the very least they can like move around. I guess they're not going to be jogging around anywhere, but they're not having like severe heart problems or anything at that particular moment in time.
So we're wanting away the future risks.
Yeah. Just at that point in time, would you say this person is suffering or just experiencing a lack of well-being?
Yeah, so we can certainly imagine someone with obesity, and in virtue of their obesity, they're just at this neutral point where, they're not suffering from it really, but they're not also like really experiencing. It's also preventing them from experiencing well-being because they can't move around as much. they're not to the point where they're suffering, but they're not getting like the day, they can't stop and smell the roses or whatever. And so they're being deprived of well-being.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the question is, will they still be approved for Ozempic? And the answer is yes, insurance will cover that.
Sure. Which I think is fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Because I think that generally that like not experiencing any well-being, I'm pretty sure is considered a symptom to some extent, right? Like anhedonia, for instance, is like it's not necessarily suffering. It's just an absence of a lot of what we would expect from normal human experiences, right?
Right. Okay, cool. So then you would include, presumably, because of judging by your motivation, but correct me if I'm wrong, so you would include people who have this type of anhedonia or like lack of gender euphoria, or however you want to classify it, as trans, even if they're not suffering in the sense of how we're using the term gender dysphoria in medicine.
I guess it's conceivable if these people exist, yeah.
Okay, so both a deprivation of well-being and the experience of suffering would qualify one to be transgender, or have gender dysphoria in the way that you're using that term.
Yeah, it's conceivable, yeah, or hypothetically conceivable at least.
Okay. Here's another. Let me talk to you about the moderate severe thing. So here's the thing. So there's different costs of gender affirming care depending on what you're talking about. Some treatments I get the motivation. Surgeries are really costly, and it's not just the surgery; it's the aftercare and everything like that. Including everything, it costs $100,000, not just the surgery itself, but everything that goes around that. So if you want to, I understand the motivation to have restrictions based on and prioritizing those who are really suffering the most. There are some gender-affirming cares that are relatively inexpensive. And there's been papers on this, there's been analysis, and it really doesn't cost the U.S. healthcare system really basically anything in comparison. Relatively. Would you, for people who have like a moderate form of gender incongruence that may not meet your threshold, because you said it's severe, do you think they should be precluded from having insurance cover the relatively inexpensive like hormone pills or whatever, hormone therapy?
I would have to there would have to be like some process to ascertain who's actually trans at that point, and I don't know what criteria you would include.
Yeah, I mean, so here's the thing. Sure, I grant that. I mean, but my motivation here is because my motivation of what I'm doing now is I'm trying to get you to lower your threshold. Instead of just saying like, okay, well, unless everyone meets the severe criteria, they're trans, and then if they're trans, they have access to all the different forms of gender-affirming care, and all of it's covered. Rather, just tier the levels, just have some sort of tiered system, call them all transgender, but then just have subsets. Transgender with moderate dysphoria, transgender with severe dysphoria, transgender with... I mean, really just transgender with gender... I would encourage just the standard usage, transgender with gender incongruency, transgender with gender dysphoria. You can classify the severity. But once you do that, you can say, okay, well, then we can talk about what kind of therapies we're going to prioritize and tier depending on how expensive or inexpensive they are. I think that would be a lot more productive than just to say, well, you have to really, really be suffering or really being deprived of everything in order to just be, or else what are you even doing? Because there are therapies that really don't cost us that much to give to people, and they would improve their lives. And it would improve their lives in virtue of a gender incongruency.
Let's say that is there a percentage of people identifying this that would worry you at some point? Like, let's say 30% of people under this new definition went and they got drugs prescribed to them relating to their gender. Would that be an okay outcome?
Like 30% of the U.S. population, you're saying?
Yeah, that's a huge number.
Yeah, because then, what would end up happening is actually I haven't done the math, but yeah. So I grant that if, to be clear, I don't think that would happen, but engaging with the hypothetical, if that did happen, then even a relatively inexpensive medication.
Wait, no. We're not talking expensive drugs. That's easy. Let's say that the
drugs.
I
said inexpensive.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said inexpensive. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I said a relatively inexpensive medication. Even a relatively inexpensive medication can become expensive to the taxpayer if and cause supply shortages of the medication for people who need it more if all of a sudden everyone starts to do it. And yes, and look, there have been cases of that happening in other situations. So for example, with obesity, there are certain diabetes medications that are only approved for obesity but work better. Only approved for diabetes but work better for obesity, like tirzepatide from Eli Lilly, which works better than Ozempic. And so everyone's rushing to get tirzepatide because it works better as a GLP-1 to treat one's obesity and get one thin.
Yeah, but that's I think obesity is something we can recognize concretely as a negative thing that could create positive.
Yeah, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that there are plenty of examples where when availability happens, more people want it, and then we put more restrictions on it because we recognize.
Yeah,
it.
but
Okay,
I don't think there's a worry about like more people wanting it in the case of obesity because we can clearly see who's obese. We don't think that people are just identifying as obese because they think it'll make them happier. Whereas
no, even if they're not obese anymore, they get approved for it. Like, it's not an issue of like the pharmacist.
I don't understand, like, especially if you've got like effeminate men, or especially if you've got people in certain communities that are like, oh God, it would be so cool to be a woman. Like, I don't understand how you would ever go about diagnosing these people as trans if we're saying, oh, dysphoria is not even part of it. And then boom.
Wait. Let me.
Oh God, sorry.
I'm trying to keep it on the flow of the conversation. So your question to me was, what if 30% of the people for this relatively inexpensive therapy, what if they all just started wanting it and instead of 1% of the population or whatever, it became 30? Then my answer is I would understand more restrictions put in place and more tiered systems put in place for it. And we do. And my point is just we do that all the time with other medicine.
What would the restrictions start to look like, though? I feel like at some point you'd be rebuilding my world, where I would say, okay, well, for a restriction, we're going to actually requar some level of dysphoria to gain access to this drug or something.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, but that the point is that you're doing it in a context where we have current availability to treat all of them with a very inexpensive medication, and the difference is you would deny them and I would grant them, and I would only not grant them if it became an issue. And if it didn't become an issue, I would grant them. But I would take your side if it became a supply issue or if it became an expense issue. My only point here is that if that's not the case, then why not grant them their alleviation of their moderate gender incongruency?
Because I don't even know if I believe that they can have moderate gender incongruency without experiencing dysphoria. That was kind of like the initial part. Like,
you just said.
I said for the purpose of your hypothetical, I can understand there might be a person with no dysphoria who might think they might be happier as like a woman. But I guess like realistically, in reality, I don't know how many of those people exist, or if those people exist. I'm not sure if that's a thing. Go ahead.
Wait. So you're saying that, just to make sure I understand, are you saying that you don't know if people can exist, that trans people can exist with a moderate gender incongruency without gender dysphoria?
Yeah, correct. They would experience extreme euphoria as women. Yeah.
Okay, so the reason I brought that up is because I thought that you were defining gender dysphoria in terms of a severe form of gender incongruency. Was I wrong about that?
The dysphoria definition I believe I gave when you and Pisco were in here was dysphoria is the intense feelings of discomfort that arise from the incongruency. So it's hard to imagine somebody who's
moderate or severe.
What?
Wasn't there a point where we asked about moderate or severe and you insisted that there needed to be like a severe?
Well, I think we said moderate to severe, I think is what we settled on. But it's got to be more than just like I'm unhappy because my boobs are small today or something, right? It's got to be something.
Right. Okay, so you'd include. Okay, so it's sounding like we're converging then, because you would include those experiencing moderate gender dysphoria then.
Yeah.
Okay.
But somebody with no gender dysphoria who's like, I wake up, I see myself as I'm in the mirror, and I'm cool with that. But like maybe I'd really want to be a woman, that'd be fun. I wouldn't consider that person trans, at least not in the same way.
Yeah. Okay. And so you could, that's fine. Mild to moderate. I presume you would say that they're. Look, regardless of where on the scale we're going here, I think the point I'm making is that we're just tiering. If your motivation is to not cost the healthcare system money on people who aren't suffering that much, the point I'm making is just that we can tier it in such a way where we assign the less severe cases. Even, if you're drawing it at moderate, I can say, okay, well, mild to moderate.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but I think there's a scare or I think there might be a worry at identifying a group of trans people that have no dysphoria, that a lot of people maybe wouldn't consider trans, as having access to the same medications and treatments as actual trans people. Because I think then there would be a desire to basically lump all of these people in together.
No, I grant the fear, and that's why you have your view. I'm offering you an alternative classification system that prevents that as well. Just
but
like,
I don't know if the tiered one
novel.
I don't know if the tiered one necessarily works. Like even in a case where we have no tiers around a lot of mental issues, people don't even believe they're real. Like a lot of people don't believe that like GAD or depression, like a lot of people think these things aren't real, right? And these things don't even have a tiered thing. It's just like all or nothing, and people don't believe those are real. I believe if we tiered off gender dysphoria, and now you'd have a whole group of people, and likely the people with no dysphoria would probably be the largest group of people, right? That would be trans. Now your largest group of trans people are people with no dysphoria whatsoever, who are like going into a clinic like they would a tattoo shop or a hair parlor. I don't know. That just seems like a really negative way to categorize those people as trans people.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying that, just so I understand, so you're saying that if we have a system that where we tier trans people with no dysphoria, trans people with mild, moderate, severe dysphoria, if we have such a system like that, your fear is that the tiered system would not preclude more costly medication for people with no dysphoria?
Well, the original thing that I was saying, hold on, I'm getting turned around.
I'm just asking, like, what could...
No, yeah, I understand. So so if here's my issue, okay? If we have mild dysphoria, severe dysphoria, I'm sorry, if we have mild, moderate, and severe dysphoria, this is all dysphoria, okay? All these people I would say are trans, okay? They've got dysphoria, it can be alleviated with some surgery, right? However, if we were to include another subgroup here, and we were to say people with no dysphoria that want to transition, I think that group of people would overwhelm all the other three categories combined. The people with no dysphoria, that group of people would be larger than people with mild, moderate, and severe. And I think it would do damage to that whole the top group of people. It would be like that categorization would become meaningless or destructive, I think. Here's a question actually for you. Okay, let's say that I were to say, okay, we have major depressive disorder. Okay, we've got MDD. We're actually going to blow this out a little more. We are going to actually start including people who are sad or depressed that don't need medication but might need other things. Like, do you think that would be harmful?
Like,
do you think that'd be
therapy or?
Sure, it could be therapy. It could be, maybe we try giving them SSRIs, I guess. I don't know, or whatever. What?
We already include people with major depressive disorder and people who just, who are successfully treated with therapy.
Yeah, but don't you think we treat these groups of people like a bit differently? Like if you have major depressive disorder, that's different than just like having some depression.
Well, oh yeah, absolutely. Look, yes, we have there are diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder, and that's not the same thing as someone just saying they're sad.
Sure, there's probably also there's an underlying fact of the matter as well. I think in terms of a difference, somebody who's sad or depressed because of something that's going on is a lot different than somebody with no external stimuli having like major depressive disorder, right?
Yeah. No. I like obviously this is coming from their brains, and there's something.
Sure. I mean, it's all from the brain. Yeah, but
yeah. But okay. So a couple of things. So yeah. Okay. So if so the concern is that we don't want to include trans people who have zero dysphoria, and by zero dysphoria, just to be clear, we're talking about trans people who have no gender incongruency. Really. That's how you're using the term.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So there's no suffering that they're experiencing in virtue of a gender-sex mismatch, and there is no well-being outside of the norm that's being prevented in virtue of a gender-sex mismatch.
Yeah.
Okay. So we probably will agree a lot more then. So we're going to probably agree a lot more based on how you're using those terms. Like on those usages of the terms, I suspect we'll agree a lot more. The things I would try to convince you on are a couple of things. I guess one thing, it sounded like you were more insistent on just including the severe ones, but now you're agreeing that you would include the mild ones even as well.
Well, I think in the beginning, I think there was a word thing that happened. So you keep saying moderate, mild, or severe. Maybe we need to iron this out still. You keep saying mild, moderate, or severe dysphoria, and I'm identifying dysphoria as like the intense feelings of discomfort you're getting for not being. So even if you have mild dysphoria, you'll still have mild feelings of intense discomfort. So mild,
Okay.
moderate, and severe are all dysphoria. And anybody with dysphoria, I would say, but there's probably a spectrum of dysphoria. Like some people especially, right? Like if you're like Tabor snapping and you are like a trans woman, like because Tabor's super tall, broad shoulders, that person's probably gonna be a lot more dysphoric than a very like femme presenting man, probably, right? I'd imagine, right? But I would consider the whole spectrum of dysphoric people to be trans. But somebody with no dysphoria or no big feelings of sadness or badness or whatever about like a mismatch between like a gender incongruency, I would consider that person, if you want to call them trans, you can, but I think they have to go in a fundamentally different category because that group of people is going to dwarf all the other trans people, and I think that their outcomes and everything are going to be significantly different.
Right. So so I'm not drawing the line correctly on your view when I say they're not experiencing any suffering and they're not being deprived of any well-being that the person would be, because your usage of the word of any dysphoria includes an intense feeling, meaning that there's already a severity baked into the cake there.
Yeah, kind of. So when you say like mild dysphoria, it's like having like mild stage 4 lymphoma or something.
Okay, I see.
Sorry.
Okay, so someone can experience a certain amount of suffering in virtue of a gender-sex mismatch, and that could be a fact of the matter in their brain, but they can still not meet gender dysphoria in the way you're using it.
Yeah, I guess it just depends on how on if I believe those people exist, which I'm not sure if I do. Like I can conceive of it for a hypothetical. Like I conceive of a 6-legged person that might need special shoes designed for them. And I could grant the factories and everything we need to, but in the real world, I don't know if I believe that those people exist. That there are people that are trans that just like don't care that much. They're like,
Can you conceive of it being like maybe a bimodal distribution? Like on the one end of the spectrum, you just have a lot of non-binaries just identifying for clout. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have like another mode where you have like people with really like severe, intense gender incongruency that's causing them a lot of problems. But then you have like this area in between the bimodal where you have like, okay, well, these people don't really meet either category of those things. They're clearly not just doing it for the fuck of it. They're not doing it for the clout. They're not like doing it for Twitter. The likes or whatever, but they also are not like, they're not about to jump off a bridge either for it. What do you think about those types of people? Do you think those don't exist, or?
I don't know. I'd have to think about it a lot. I don't think that there are people that have that gender-sex mismatch, or if it is all bimodal and they're so like modally clustered in that area. I don't know if I'd consider them trans. They might just be like more effeminate men or more masculine women, but I don't know if I would say that rises to the level of like trans. Like that's probably where the overlap would be my guess.
Let's say a relatively inexpensive medication like gender-affirming hormone therapy would take these individuals and would, because we already specified that they have some form of gender-sex mismatch, that would be, but it doesn't rise to the level that is as intense as you drew the threshold. Say if they were to be treated with gender-affirming hormone therapy relatively inexpensively, it would alleviate their not intense, moderate level of gender incongruency. Would you be opposed to that?
I'm not sure. You're asking me to conceive of a person who's not cognizant that they have severe gender, that they feel like, I don't even know what they're feeling. They feel neutral towards gender, and then
you can conceive of it. I can give it over. This is a person who says, "Look, I feel like I have some sort of gender-sex mismatch here, and I do feel sad about that. And day to day, I feel sad. It's not to the point where I can't work. It's not to the point where I can't maintain a relationship. It's not to the point where I can't get out of bed and do my daily activities. But it's there. It's kind of like that piece of gum that's stuck on my shoe, every step I take. I can still do everything with that piece of gum stuck on my shoe, but it really annoys me.
I guess it's figuring out, because at some point I'm going to say, if it's just like something that makes you a little bit sad, I'd say it's probably something you need to work on beyond doing drug therapy for your sex. But like when you use that phrase there, it's really annoying. That starts to feel like a little bit more dysphoric, in which case maybe drug therapy is the way to go. But if it's just like a moderate to mild feeling of where like, I don't really know how I feel, blah, blah, then I'd probably say there's something more important to explore there, or there's something else that's probably wrong with you, rather than going down the drug therapy route for treatment.
Sure. I mean, I'm just talking about in a setting where we we do all the exploration. We do all the exploration, we do see all the psychiatrists say, okay, no, this is not quite fitting with major depressive disorder. It's not quite fitting with anxiety. It's not quite, but it really does seem to fit with a gender incongruency issue. It's not a form in which I'm worried about this person committing suicide. It's not a form in which I'm worried about this person missing work. It's not a form in which I'm worried about this person breaking up with their, boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever. But it's there and it's bothering them. The question I have to you is, would you be opposed to a inexpensive therapy that, if it would alleviate that degree of bothersome?
I think at that point I might have to start appealing to empirical outcomes, because I can conceive of what you're saying in a hypothetical, but I don't know in a real world if this group of people exists who are I'm I'm a man.
Look, let's just say the outcomes show that in this target population that alleviates that degree of.
Well, yeah, like I said, hypothetically, I mean, if it showed it, it showed it.
No, I
right?
just want to know what your view is if that were the case.
Well, I mean, my view is going to be maximizing probably people's outcomes, right? So if it is the case that
would you consider them trans if that's your motive, given that this is your motivation for this inclusive exclusive definition of trans?
Yeah, I probably would, or a type of trans people, I guess, is conceivable. Yeah. Okay,
cool. So all right, so then it's not. So then you don't. So based on how you're talking about gender dysphoria, you don't need to have gender dysphoria in the way that you've defined it in order to be transgender.
Maybe not in all possible worlds. There might be a world where this group of people exists where I would say you don't need dysphoria to be trans. But in the current world we live in, beyond conceptual hypotheticals, I would say that you need dysphoria to be trans, because I don't know if I agree or believe.
Well, you don't know if you need dysphoria to be, because you're saying you don't know if those people exist, right?
Well, yeah, I don't know if they exist, so it's hard for me to contend.
Yeah, so you don't know. So you don't know if you need to have gender dysphoria to be transgender.
Well, I would have to be. I wouldn't just assume that I'm going to say there might be some people, we could say that with literally every disease ever, right?
Well, I mean,
that for instance, you don't need anything in the DSM to have depression, because there might be some people that have depression that don't have any of the things listed in these. I guess it's possible, but if I haven't seen any of them, I wouldn't make that assumption, right?
By the way, I don't think it's. Just as an aside here, I don't think we're just talking in some vacuum here. I do think these people exist.
I understand that, but I don't. Right now, it seems
I know.
Yeah, sure.
Because that's an empirical matter we can resolve.
Yeah, I understand, but it seems like right now our empirical issue is we're having a lot of trouble identifying even who is trans. That seems to be a really difficult thing, and that's with people that even have moderate to severe symptoms of supposedly being trans. Mm-hmm. So to blow this category open even more, when it feels like organizations want to pump the brakes on who's actually trans, it just seems like it's going the total opposite direction of the medical discussion.
Don't you think that might just be because of all don't you think this whole thing might be at least the waters might be muddied by all for example, what you're describing when you have non-binary people just identifying, or people identifying for clout or whatnot, and that's just clogging a lot of the system, whether in research and or otherwise.
I mean, that could be. That could be bothering it too, but it could also be that some of these things are substitutes for other types of treatment. So for instance, there might be people that aren't trans that would benefit from hormones. So for instance, it might be that you take a very tomboyish woman who doesn't feel super strong attachment to her gender, and we zap her brain and we scan it, and she's absolutely not trans. However, giving her testosterone actually just makes her feel a whole lot better, because testosterone does a lot of cool things to the body. And, she has a little bit of, maybe she even starts to feel, or she would have a little bit of dysphoria about masculinizing, but she doesn't care. It's actually overcome by the positive feelings of testosterone, and now she's like, fuck it, this is awesome, right? So in that world, now you've got a person who didn't have dysphoria, who would have fit, and now who's transitioning a little bit, and their actually outcomes are improved. But I don't know if I would consider that necessarily a good thing. That would be scary. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, and I'm not suggesting that and look, there's some research to that point that testosterone can have certain mental effects that can be alleviating to certain depressive symptoms, and that is one of the points that gender critical activists or academics raise in the literature. So yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting that just treatment response alone. I mean, there's more to it. There's more about what, in virtue of what is the treatment response and how do we ascertain that? But anyway, okay. But so the point is that, so you're saying that, okay, so you're saying, okay, you don't need to be you don't need to have gender dysphoria to be transgender. It's just that I happen to think that of all the cases that I've seen of people who really are transgender, they did end up having gender dysphoria.
Well, yeah, but I mean, if you're using the definitions that way, that's true of literally every single definition of every single thing ever.
Well, that's not true.
Really?
No, because you can have analytic definitions that completely exclude all those cases, even if you don't, regardless of whether.
Yeah, but I'm saying I could conceive of people with any mental illness that don't have any of the qualifications of that mental illness. It's that's possible for every single mental illness, right? Maybe there's some people.
Wait. For example, if I say if I can take your definition right now and say, look, you have to have an intense feeling. And if I give you an example, a counterexample, where someone does not have this intense feeling, but it is a moderate feeling in virtue of this gender, sex, and congruency, you could have just said no. And the reason no is because, by definition, they don't meet my criteria. That would be an example where it's just analytically the case where...
Yeah, I guess, but when these criteria that we're assigning aren't really the thing itself. We're trying to use the criteria, I think, as a proxy for the underlying fact of the matter, or at least I am, right? So the underlying fact of the matter is that...
you're willing to adjust then, that is what you're saying.
Yeah, sure. Well, necessarily, yeah. If your brain, so again, I'm working off of this definition that if your brain is sexed differently than your body for whatever reason, if that's even a thing, which I think it's kind of the idea that we're pointed at, but if that's a thing, then that makes you trans. But it seems like a proxy for that would be dysphoria. That if you have feelings of other feelings and you want to transition, but you don't have that feeling of just dysphoria, there's probably a different underlying fact of the matter, like depression or some other issue going on, rather than you being trans.
Yeah. And if you were met with a case where that seems, if you were met with a case that...
If I've met with a case where you've got a magical brain scan, you scan somebody with the brain and they don't have dysphoria, then obviously I have to say, oh, okay, well, I guess that you can be trans without dysphoria. I would necessarily have to say that, right? Because I'm using dysphoria as a proxy for an underlying fact of the matter, and that underlying fact of the matter can't be analyzed yet. We can't zap somebody's brain to see if they're trans.
So the underlying fact of the matter in which you really consider people transgender is some incongruency between their mind and their sex.
Yeah.
Okay.
But even cis people can have that, no?
Well, I mean,
that in and of itself doesn't make people trans.
Well, right. Yeah. I mean, it has to rise to a certain level where I imagine he would say that it.
Well, then, okay, at what level do you consider somebody trans? Is it just like that's scales of...
Yeah, so it's not just the proxy that has to be intense. So it seems like if that's the view, then it really is like what you're talking about has to be a certain level.
No. This is absolutely like a misunderstanding of what gender is and what it means to be transgender. Being
I'm
transgender...
trying to work with his definition and trying to understand.
Well, what I'm saying is that the definition is fundamentally flawed. When we're defining people by the incongruency between this idealized form of masculinity or femininity and how you are perceived by society, a lot of people fall into that category, including cis people. You cannot say, it just needs to be of a higher degree, and then that makes you trans.
So what we mean by, I take it what we mean by trans is that there is a mismatch between one's gender and one's sex. So that's the starting point. So they have a gender, and then they have a sex, and then their gender and sex. There's an incongruency between the two.
I think we need to define terms here.
Okay, sure.
What do we mean when we say gender, first of all? Or
yeah.
What do you mean?
Okay. Yeah. So what I mean here in this context is. I mean weighted characteristics that are masculine or feminine. And the weighting is mostly on the mental characteristics, specifically of preference-based characteristics. So those are going to be the kind of characteristics that include things like how one desires to be perceived in society, how one if one desires to be perceived in the archetypical way that a female or male is indexed to that society, or if one wants to be treated in a certain way of the archetypical male or female indexed to that society, or if one desires to look like the archetypical male or female indexed to how they look in that society. Those are going to be the kind of weighty, those are going to be the kind of characteristics that are more weighty.
Sure. So to give a more simplified definition, I think we could maybe, if you disagree, let me know. Gender is the way that society perceives you in relations to masculinity and femininity in relation to your sex?
Not exact. I mean, that's one definition. It's not. If you're asking me on my definition, that's not quite it, because it's also about how the individual. It's not so much about how society perceives the individual as much as how the individual wants. Because on my view, how the individual wants to be perceived is.
How
also
can an individual have any sort of conceptualization of how they want to be perceived outside of how we societally know genders are perceived, right? Like,
well,
this idea that it's like a purely internal experience is not true, right?
Wait a minute. Wait. Do you see an issue with me saying society perceives person X as a man, but person X wants to be perceived by society as a woman?
What I'm saying is that wanting, or just because society perceives as...
if you could just answer, like, do you think that there's anything like incoherent about what I just said?
Go ahead and repeat it.
What I said, right?
Could you repeat it?
Yeah, sure. Person X is seen by society as a man. Person X wants to be or desires to be seen by society as a woman. Do you understand what I just said?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, that is the type of thing that's one of the weighted characteristics that factors into gender, on my view. Do you understand that, what I just said?
Well, what do you mean by that? Because you could mean a bunch of different things. I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
so do you understand? Like, so you don't understand what I'm saying when I say there's different characteristics and they could be weighted, and each of that could tick the needle in favor of man or woman. Like, does that concept? Are we getting a mutual understanding there?
As far as the way that society perceives you in alignment with these sort of gender norms that we associate with man or woman, right?
Not all of them. I gave you a counterexample. So one counterexample that I am using as a weighting for gender is how the individual wants to be seen rather than how they are seen. So whether you agree with that or not is a different story, but do you understand what I'm saying?
I believe I do understand what you're saying, but so why are you making this distinction between how somebody wants to be perceived and how they are perceived?
Yeah, so because one of the motivations is with talking to a number of trans people. One hypothetical that's come up is like, well, what if you're just external to society? What if you're just found yourself on an island with a mirror, and that's it? Like, would you experience dysphoria? Would you care? And the majority of people I've spoken to say, like, well, yeah, I still would care. That I would still like, it would still bother me when I look in the mirror.
It's impossible to know that. That's an absolutely absurd thing to even suggest. How can you have an incongruency about your gender, right? When gender is a social phenomenon, right? If you are in a vacuum where no society exists, right?
But on my usage of the term gender, that's what's in contention. That it's purely a societal phenomenon.
Well, okay.
It's not even in contention. I shouldn't even say
no. But the question here is, can somebody experience gender dysphoria outside of the context of gender norms, right?
Yeah. So if by gender, yeah. So gender, and so
the answer is no. Absolutely not.
So I don't see how that follows. If you want to draw the entailment, I'm happy to hear the argument, but. So I don't see how that follows, I certainly don't see how it follows on my usage of the word gender, and I don't see how there's any.
Well, this is the problem. Is I think that your understanding of what gender is or how it comes about is sort of lacking.
Okay. Wait. Hold on. When you say my understanding of what gender is, are you just saying that there's another usage of the word gender and that I'm not understanding it, or are you just saying that I have a usage of the word gender that you don't like the way I'm using it?
What I'm saying is that I don't like the way that you are using gender, because I think we can all.
But that's very different than me lacking an understanding of the way other people use it.
Understanding gender within the context of what we're talking about, right? Gender dynamics.
In the context of what we're talking about, I was just trying to understand Destiny's uses of the word gender and see what his views showed until you came in here and started grilling about my view for some reason. But I'm happy to answer. I mean, which by the way, I'm happy to do. I'm happy to answer your questions. But the context of this conversation didn't involve any of that. It was just me trying to understand Destiny's view and seeing if on his view.
Right. And what I'm trying to say is that the reason I think that there's a disconnect is because we're talking about these terms in ways that are different.
Yeah, that's why I was trying to clear it up.
Right. So to clear up why I have that disagreement with, you pose the hypothetical of a person who experiences could a person in a vacuum outside of society or like these sort of gender norms experience gender dysphoria? Well, then we would have to ask the question, well, what is gender dysphoria and why does it happen?
Yeah, so what I take gender dysphoria to be, to be clear, this is a person who's like plucked out of society and put in a vacuum, right? It's not like they grew up in a vacuum like forever. Like they didn't, like I grant the case, like if someone just grew up as a baby in a vacuum without any society, like they wouldn't. I wouldn't have a notion of a gender. They wouldn't have a notion of a lot of things. They probably wouldn't have language either. Like a lot of their language faculties would be messed up. But so we take a person, we pluck them out of society, we put them on an island, and the question is, can they experience gender dysphoria? And I take gender dysphoria to be either a deprivation of well-being or an experience of suffering in virtue of a incongruency between one's gender and one's sex. And I take one's gender. Well, I gave you an account of that already. You didn't like it, but I gave you the types of weightings. Not all of them were societal dependent. And then I can give you an account of sex as well if you'd like. Sex is archetypical of the reproductive strategy in which one produces large or small gametes, or a certain physiologic proximity to to one that produces a large or small gametes. Okay, cool. So the answer is I certainly don't see why someone couldn't, based on my account of gender, because one can desire to look like the archetypical sex that they are not on an island, and they can see the mirror on the island and see that they don't. And so that's one of the weighted characteristics of gender. And so there could totally be a mismatch between one's gender and one's sex, and that can totally cause suffering. So yes, of course, someone could, on my usage of the word gender, one can have gender dysphoria on an island, sure.
Okay, so yes, given that the hypothetical, like you said, is somebody that has already lived within the context of society, already understands the societal pressures and gender norms that is pushed on the different sexes, right?
Yeah. Look, I'm not talking about someone who was a fetus on an island outside of anyone else, because then they wouldn't even know any words. Yeah, I'm not talking about that.
Okay.
The language center wouldn't develop.
Yeah, so okay.
The main motivation here is, look, the point is that there are certain things that matter. When I speak to transgender people, there are certain things that matter to them. And it's not just that I want society to perceive me this. It's not just that how society perceives me. There's a desire of what they want it to be. They want society to perceive them in a way.
And what is that based off of, is what I'm asking you.
What is that belief based off of? That's based off my belief that certain transgender people desire that is me asking them that, and they telling me that they do.
No. What I'm asking you is that feeling that they have, right? That motivation that they have. What is that based on?
I imagine so. That's a subject of current neuroscience study. That I imagine that has to do with certain underlying facts about the brain. And
so, do you think that there is a transgender brain? That's what you believe?
Yes, I think it is coming from the brain. I mean, sure.
Why do you think that? Not coming from the brain, but that brain structure.
I don't know if it's structure per se. Wait, that's a different claim. I don't know. It could be structure. It could be channel response. It could be the type of synapses. It could be the type of neurotransmitters. It could be sensitivity to certain neurotransmitters in certain areas. I'm not committed to like it having to be a structure. I'm just saying there's some sort of currently not well researched underlying difference about the brain, whatever that may be, and that is causing this type of response.
Okay, so this is where I'm coming from, right? The way that I view.
Do you disagree with anything I just said? Like, do you think I said something false?
I think that if we are okay, so this is part of the reason I came in here. The idea that
can you answer that question. Do you think I just said anything false? Like, do we disagree on any of the propositions I just said?
I don't think so. Not necessarily.
Okay, cool. So,
Like, okay, so insofar as that, I think that brains can develop in different ways, and that is maybe related to one's sex in certain ways, right?
yeah, brains can develop in certain ways. Certain are archetypical of a certain sex, and certain are archetypical of another sex. And then there are certain ways that brains can develop in which there is a incongruency between one sex and one's gender.
Okay. So what I'm saying is that I don't think that trans people exist because there is this brain in their body that is the idea that there's a female brain in a male body, right? I don't think that this is bared out in anything scientific, and
Wait, I think there might be a disconnect on what's being said here. When I said female brain in a male body, I don't mean that like a trans person has an archetypically female, like a trans woman is someone who has an archetypically female brain and structure or neurochemical or anything like that, and then but there's a mismatch between the brain. No, that's not what's being said here. What's being said here is that there's some underlying fact in the brain, whatever that might be, that's causing the feeling as if one is having a mismatch between one's gender and one's sex, such that their gender is a woman and they are a male, for example.
Sure. And so I would ask you the question, well, do you think that is caused societally? Like, so let's say that we take
Yeah, there's an interplay, of course. Like anything, all of these things. Like,
okay,
my language.
Let's say that we take somebody that is born a female, is kind of tomboyish, right? Has no sort of connection to what is stereotypically associated with women. They don't like pink, girly things, whatever. Do you think that at what point does this person become trans, or are they already trans, or is
the main things is their, again, as we've already gone over, the main weighted characteristics are going to be the preference-based ones. Like, does this person have a desire to be treated in the archetypical way of the other sex? Does they want to look the way the archetypical sex is? Do they want called in the way the archetypical sex is? Do all of those things apply? Do they want? If you ask the question, do you want to be the other sex? Like, do you want? Like, is that something you desire? So the weighted characteristics are mostly going to be preference based. Not to say that that's the end all be all, but that's where most of the weighting is going to come from.
Wait, can I ask a question on this? I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe this is like the ultimate question. Do you think somebody else can want to be the other sex and not be trans?
Right.
Yeah, no, someone else can want to be the other sex and not be trans because they're, for example, I'll give you one example. Like, one example is someone who wants to be the other sex out of like some sexual fetish and not because of any gender sex incongruency.
So then the question would be how do you distinguish from somebody that would want to be the other sex that isn't trans versus somebody who wants to be the other sex and has no dysphoria?
So wait, so could you repeat the question?
You've got two people.
Mm-hmm.
One person wants to be the other. One person wants to become the other sex, but they're not trans, and the other person is trans with no dysphoria, but they want to also become the other sex. How do you distinguish between these two people?
No, and to be clear, no dysphoria is in the way you're using the word dysphoria.
Yeah, no feelings of discomfort.
No intense feelings, right? The intense is doing a lot of work there.
Okay, hold on. Let me just verify. Is this the only source of disagreement we have? Is that word intense? If you think
I think a lot of things may clear up if you abandon that part, because you keep going back to whenever you abandon the degree contingency on your definition. I think we mostly collapse into a lot of agreement, but then you kind of find a way back into like
I think the reason why this has gotten so abstracted, there's so many orders. Okay, this isn't your fault. I'm sorry, just clarifying this. I think the reason why people use intense feeling of discomfort surrounded to gender is because I think a mild feeling of discomfort, I think it's going to be really hard to pinpoint if that's actually caused by gender or not. So, for instance, let's say
that's an epistemic question.
Let's say that a man that is like flabby and doesn't have very much musculature, let's say they feel like some form of like dysphoria, but it's not like intense, but they're just like, I wish I looked more masculine or something like that, right? But we call that gender dysphoria. or are they just like sad that they're like kind of flabby and not muscular enough, right? Like I think that's why the intense modifiers in there is to like really ascertain whether or not this feeling is due to gender and there's not some other sort of problem going on.
So it's there for pragmatic purposes, but it doesn't really define what would be transgender on your view. Would that be fair?
Yeah, or like a feeling like if somebody wakes up and they're like they can function on their day-to-day life, like they do okay, but they're just like they're internally like, God, fuck, like I hate being a man. Like I feel like a woman so much, and it sucks that like my body. I feel like I'm never gonna match or whatever. But they're not like suicidal or anything. But they have that feeling. Like I think you would say maybe that's not an intense feeling discovered, but I would say that's an intense feeling. So I'm wondering how much of our disagreement is just lying in that intense thing. Because the reason I'm asking that is because now when you ask me that, it sounds like you're saying some sort of psychological incongruence needs to exist. Otherwise, you wouldn't consider that person trans, or
yeah, some sort of psychological incongruence. And by what that I just mean that either some sort of suffering is happening in virtue of the incongruence, or a deprivation of well-being is happening in virtue of the incongruence. And
okay, so let's go with on the deprivation of well-being. How would you clarify between a person who merely has the deprivation of well-being versus the person who wants to transition for sexual reasons? How would you figure out which one is trans and which one is not?
Okay, so the person who merely wants to transition for sexual reasons, I mean, there's versus a person who wants to transition because of a gender-sex incongruency and out of a deprivation of well-being. So, I mean, one way you can do is you can interview these patients. You can ask them, like, what are your motivations for transition? Why do you want to transition? Not a perfect way, but... And if, like, one person tells you, like, well, every time I think about being the other person, I just, like, I can't help but masturbate and get off all the time. Well, I mean, that clearly favors one hypothesis than the other, versus someone else who just says, like, well, I mean, you know, I never really felt this happy except when I imagine myself in the other sex's body, and I just imagine myself being treated in the way that they're treated, imagine myself interacting in society the way that they typically are, and I imagine myself looking that way, and you know, I just never, it's just the happiest feeling I've had. Like, yeah, I mean, these two answers clearly support different hypotheses. So one way you could do it is by interviewing.
Okay.
Do you think that you seem to be using gender euphoria in a way that I've never heard people use it? Gender euphoria is the absence of gender dysphoria, right? So doing certain things that make that dysphoria go away, right?
That's not what that's not how I'm using it.
Okay, so gender. Okay, well then you're using it differently.
Yeah. I mean, I can clear
gender. You're using gender euphoria to describe a positive feeling about one's gender.
About one's gender in virtue of a gender-sex congruency that's being corrected.
Right, and so by this definition, cis people can experience that as well, right?
Yeah. There's nothing about. I'm not saying, to be clear, I'm not saying everyone with gender euphoria is transgender. Of course, cis people can experience gender euphoria. I've experienced gender euphoria. The point is just that if someone wants to transition to the other sex, someone starts saying, "Listen, I don't just want to have a gender euphoria that I'm missing. I want to have it, and I'm going to start the process of transitioning to the other sex to get it." Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to call that person transgender.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm back.
So,
Yeah.
So you think that basically you can be transgender without experiencing gender dysphoria because any amount of incongruency with the idealized form of masculinity or femininity in respect to your sex makes you trans?
It doesn't have to be any amount, to be clear. It could be. It just has to be. If we're defining, it also depends on how we're defining gender dysphoria. Because the way Destiny's defining gender dysphoria, he will include all those things as gender dysphoria. Like, he'll include things about deprivation of well-being and not just experiencing suffering as gender dysphoria. But when I came in, I initially thought he was only talking about suffering. But
well, I don't. It depends on how we depends on what we consider suffering or not. I'm not sure, right?
Yeah.
Like, because like So like for instance, if a woman is in a hospital and she has a child and then she holds her child for the first time, but she's not feeling like like feelings of elation or joy, I would consider that like a kind of suffering, even though she's not really suffering. She's just like missing out on a lot of well-being. But that might be.
Yeah. So you're including things like, okay. So I can work on your terms. That's fine. So you're including things like, so
there's going to be that like, that's like when I talked about like a neutral or baseline experience for humanity is not truly like neutral, because truly neutral would be like a blunt affect, which I think is like a symptom of like schizophrenia or severe other forms of like other like mental illness or whatever, right?
Sure. So you wouldn't. So okay, I can work into. To be clear, I use them differently. That's fine. I'm happy to work with it.
Yeah, I got you.
Okay. So you would include those cases as gender dysphoria. So then I think the major part of the difference is the gender dysphoria need to be an intense feeling, because there's clearly nothing inconceptual and no reason. I'd make a further point that I don't think there's reason to believe these people don't exist, that have a moderate instead of intense feelings of gender incongruency.
I guess I could probably, if we're going to say that, if we can 100% say that it is related to gender, for sure it's gender, and we can say that there are feelings of dysphoria there, I could probably drop the intense part and change it to any mild or actual. It has to be certain that it is actually dysphoria, and it's not just your like some other type is identifying that there's a gender component to it, which is usually I think what the intense is there to ascertain, not just like somebody's like feeling the bloated
there
one
for
day.
Pragmatic reasons. It's there to as a precaution but that's not what your definition is in terms of like the ontology of what you would consider transgender. It's there in terms of your epistemology.
There's going to be a line. There's going to be a varied line of people who are like, I'm trans, and I guess it sucks. And then there's people like, I'm trans, I don't want to kill myself. Probably, right?
Yeah, okay. So it's not like you're going to say all of them are not transgender. There's probably some that are just going to get missed for pragmatic reasons, even though you may consider a small amount of them transgender.
Potentially, it's possible.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I think, so then I don't think we have a whole lot of disagreement then once we clear up those terms. The only thing I would encourage, and you can take this or leave this, I would try to encourage a more adoption of standard terminology. Number one, because I know you're using it colloquially, but I do think that when you're seriously talking about diagnosable mental illness, you don't usually strike me as a person who sticks to like colloquial terms unless you're like dunking on someone or making a joke, like calling someone the R slur or whatever. But when you're talking about like a genuine diagnosable mental illness, like you've always struck me as someone who tries to stick to how it's used and defined standardly.
Sure, but I don't know if it seems like there's hardly a standard at all in this world. Like it feels like everything in the
there is a standard of how gender dysphoria is defined. It's defined by the DSM-5, and it has certain specific criteria for inclusion and exclusion being gender dysphoria. And you can have that while acknowledging that there may be cases that are tracking some underlying meaningful gender incongruency that just hasn't risen to the level of diagnosable mental illness as gender dysphoria yet.
Sure. I guess that's possible. I guess it feels like right now the modern conversations that people are having societally aren't necessarily tracking like the strict language in the DSM, because I
agree.
Like I would say like probably the majority of people online, the majority of trans advocates probably reject like the DSM's definition of like a lot of things related to trans people or gender dysphoria. What makes a trans person, I would imagine.
Well, I'm not talking about the definition of transgender. I don't think they have. I've looked for transgender, and I don't really think they have a very rigid definition of transgender. I've searched the DSM-5 for that. Mm-hmm. They talk about it, but it's not very. They don't have like this list of criteria. They have a list of criteria for the diagnosable condition of gender dysphoria as a mental illness.
Sure.
And yes, I mean, there are transgender people who take issue with that. But whether they take issue with that or not, I mean, it is important to recognize that in medicine, that is the standard use of what is a diagnosable mental disease. And in any other context, like when I see you going into like a debate with a bunch of normies or whatever, and they're using like some sort of normie terminology, if you can call it that, or to talk about like a medical diagnosis. the first thing I usually hear you do is say, hey, you guys don't know what you're talking about. Like, this is what that is. Do you know what, like, a doctor will do? Like, a doctor is going to ask you this and this and this, and here's why, because this is how
but this is, you can give me examples of this, but this is usually going to be over, like, a lot more solid grounding. When it comes to mental diseases, a lot of this gets a lot hairier. And when it comes to trans stuff, like, all of this is super ultra cutting edge. Like, in terms of, like, all of this is being continuously debated or contested. I don't even know if there's, like, a standard of care right now that the world agrees on, or even the Western world agrees on. When it comes
standard
to
of care is different than a standard usage of a diagnosis of gender dysphoria.
No, I understand, but I'm saying, like, there's not even like a standard of care for at all for dealing with trans people, like, let alone, you know, like having conversations about what a trans person is or what constitutes gender dysphoria or any of these things. Like, all of these are ultra hotly contested. So I don't think I typically tone or language police when it comes to this when I'm arguing with other people. I'm usually pretty patient in explaining what I feel like I mean for terms or whatever. Usually I'll just get upset when people are like denying anything.
I'm not asking you to tone police or language police them as much as I am for you to just go in the direction of adopting a more standard terminology. Because I do believe there is a standard terminology, maybe not for what makes a trans person trans, but gender dysphoria as a diagnosable mental illness, there is a standard terminology for this. In psychiatry, in medicine, that is the DSM-5 criteria.
But is anybody, if I use the DSM-5 criteria for gender dysphoria, that's going to be something that I don't think very many other people are going to map onto, do you think, or will they?
Yeah, I think an easy way for you to reach them is to say, you're talking about gender, you're talking about suffering from gender incongruency. Gender incongruency is an all-encompassing term. It can include gender dysphoria, and it can include non-gender dysphoria that causes suffering. That doesn't rise to the level of it being a diagnosable mental illness. I think that's the appropriate term that is more all-encompassing and maybe a bit at the cost of being a little bit more ambiguous or vague. But gender incongruency would be the better way to describe that. Because I do resonate with the view that, like, in order to be transgender, one needs to have, I mean, maybe not sufficient, but a necessary condition being some sort of gender incongruency at some point.
Sure, I guess. Yeah, I mean, like, I don't necessarily disagree. I'm just trying to think of an argument where I'm trying to iron out, well, this is the difference between gender incongruency versus gender dysphoria, when a lot of these people don't even believe, like, gender is a separate concept from sex. But I guess I can always be more clear when I speak. Yeah.
Well, I mean, just especially when you're talking about diagnosable mental illnesses in a serious context. But yeah. Okay, so just to wrap it up. The things that's important to us is not so much to make someone transgender is pragmatically the degree, but in terms of what we consider transgender in an ontologic setting, it's in terms of, like, what we consider that to be. It's not so much the degree of intensity. It's just that the reason for their desires to be the other sex is in virtue of some sort of gender sex incongruency that they want corrected.
Yeah, not some other issue that is manifesting that way or potentially manifesting that way.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Yeah, that's fine. And then in terms of policy, just my envisionment of this, and you can tell me if you disagree, is just to prioritize the more expensive ones for more expensive interventions for those with the more severe cases of gender sex incongruency, such as the surgeries, and the relatively inexpensive ones, such as like hormonal therapy. I would include those who have a very I would lower my standards. I would lower my thresholds of intensity of the dysphoria, because there's really not much of a cost. There's much less of a cost in that case to society. If that changes, we can raise it. That happens all the time in medicine. But so like a mild form of gender sex incongruency, but that is or moderate, and that's causing someone to have feelings of the desires wanting to be the other sex. I don't see a problem, all else equal, giving them inexpensive, non-costly to society gender-affirming hormonal therapy.
I think there's probably going to be a social cost that everybody's going to want to talk about if we're literally on some, like, gender is totally arbitrary thing, where it's like, if you feel kind of like sad about your gender sometimes, like, take a pill and switch it rather than working on something else relating to making you feel more comfortable with your body. There's probably going to be like a social cost that we're going to be talking about there at some point, I would imagine.
I don't think either of us think gender is totally. What do you mean when you say totally arbitrary?
That like, if you're having a little bit of like gender incongruency, just like a little bit of problems, like go like take some hormones and see how you feel afterwards. That's
no. I mean, look. I mean, you could probably have like. I'm not saying it has to be first line. It could be say like if you can try something. You can try therapy, and if therapy doesn't work, you can do gender affirming hormone therapy. Like the point is that at some level, like insurance will cover that because it's dirt cheap, and it doesn't really cost society that much. And in relation to it's not the biggest benefit in the world, but it makes a difference to these people.
Yeah, potentially, yeah.
Okay.
All right. Anything else?
All right. Mind waves. Did you want to grill now that I've?
I just want to see if I actually understand your position, because I'm still not sure it's coherent to my understanding, at least.
Okay. Cool. Yeah.
So when we're asking, okay, what makes somebody trans? You came in here to reject the idea that trans people necessarily have to suffer from dysphoria, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so
just to be clear, I am not including on that view. I'm not including a deprivation of healthy amounts of well-being as a form of suffering. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. And so you're saying that instead of using that standard of in order to be trans you have to have dysphoria, you're saying, well, there has to be some sort of incongruence between your gender and your sex, right? The way that you're perceived and your assigned sex or whatever. And then when met with the idea that cis people can also experience that incongruence, and that doesn't necessarily make them trans, you say, oh, well, it has to be a more extreme level.
No. That's we cleared that up. No. I see. I see the confusion. No. It's not just that there is, because cis people can have a gender incongruency. It's just that what makes someone trans is the desired direction of change. There is a gender sex incongruency, and they want to change in the direction of their sex being opposite to their gender. Like the correction, what would correct the gender sex incongruency is for them to either change their body to match their mind to be opposite, so that but like the difference between a cis person experiencing gender sex incongruency is just like for example, let's say like you just had gynecomastia. I'm assuming. Sorry, I don't know your gender. Are you man and male?
Whatever you want me to be, baby.
All right, Destiny, are you a man and? Okay.
I am. He's man and male. Yeah.
He's man and male. Okay, cool. So let's just say you started having gynecomastia, for example, and you wanted to have. You experienced a gender sex incongruency in virtue of your gynecomastia, your growing boobs. You're a cis person and you have a gender sex incongruency. The point is, though, that your direction of the correction will change you in the direction where you are just cis again. Your sex and your gender is just going to match because you are going to be man and male. Whereas with a trans person, that's not true. Like the trans person, if they have a gender sex incongruency, and they're going what the direction of correction is where they are going to be either woman and male or man and female.
Right, I understand. So, in your opinion, I'm just trying to flesh out exactly where you're at with everything. So. Do you think that incongruency is caused by like societal pressures, or do you think that basically what I'm asking you is, do you think that incongruency always needs to necessarily be some sort of affirming care, right? Does it necessarily have to affirm you with the opposite sex, or do you think that there is this incongruency that between your gender and sex that could be treated through other means?
By what I just mean by a gender sex incongruency is that there's either some suffering that's being caused by that deviation, or some well-being that's prevented by that deviation. And if that deviation were, and it's corrected in virtue of that it would be corrected in virtue of that correction. Now, if you're asking me, well, could someone have just a clarifying question? Are you asking me if someone could experience the same amount of well-being or prevent the same amount of suffering with other means, or are you telling me that the same type of well-being and the same type of suffering would be like we could have ways of giving that patient that without bridging that gender, sex incongruency? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah. So if that's what you're asking me, no. Like, just I don't think what the type of well-being and suffering that I'm talking about is just the type that is formed by this gender, sex incongruency.
Yeah, but what about the other types, though?
Oh my God! Please, can we get it?
No. All right, before we engage with Toronto.
Wait, why is Avi talking like he already knows me?
Dude, before you jump in, let me just try to get through this. We're almost done, okay?
Mindwaves, you've been almost done for the past hour, okay? You've put the fucking insomniacs to sleep. It's time to spice things up, okay? Move on from the trans, whatever the fuck is going on. This is resident sleeper as fuck. Come on now.
So what I'm gonna ask you
This is what you get for banning Jonathan, by the way. Free fucking Zerka. This is
look,
terrible news.
Look, it's possible there might be some way of doing it. Like, I'm not going to say it's impossible. It's just that I don't know of any technological way of.
Okay.
Of
So can I posit something and just see if you sort of agree with it? So in my opinion, the incongruency between one's gender and one's
Don't
sex.
say incongruency again, please.
Oh my God.
Dude, shut the fuck up. All right,
I'll pay you not to say it. I don't even have that much money.
I would argue that comes from the societal pressure to adhere to certain norms, right?
Partially, sure. I'm sure that for many people that's part of it.
So
Spam one to me, Jonathan. Spam one if you want to free Jonathan.
Okay, stop, Kratos. Let him finish our conversation. Jeez.
I would say wholly.
Oh, you would say wholly. Okay.
Yes, and you're saying partly. I'm trying to see where is the like. What do you mean by that?
So you're saying all of the gender, sex incongruency is in all transgender people is coming from how society, the pressures that society have in terms of how society sees them?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the reason why I don't think that's the case is because when I speak to transgender individuals and ask them, like, like, let's just be clear, like, you are divorced from society now. You are, like, nothing anyone in the society says or looks at you, or, like, they can't put any pressure on you anymore. They don't matter. You are now on an island for forever. Like, would you still have these same desires to be the other sex?
That question is fundamentally flawed, no?
What's the fundamental flaw?
Because you're asking somebody who has already lived within the context of these societal pressures if they would still experience those if they didn't. This person cannot possibly conceive of what it means to not have those societal pressures put on them.
So you're not saying it's like a present and ever present pressure, it's either present or past. Correct?
What do you mean by that?
Well, in the case of the island, it's what's causing them.
What fucking island are you talking about? Avi, have you been to the island?
Avi, what he's asking you to consider is, or what he's saying is, how could a trans person consider whether they'd be trans divorced from social pressures when they've already had all those social pressures thrust upon them?
Yeah, that's the past part.
Exactly.
Yeah, that is the past part. Oh,
yes,
I'm not asking. Wait. I'm not.
So when you say that, like, well, the reason I don't think that that's true is because when I ask them this question, they answer in a specific way. Well, that answer is meaningless and could be disregarded because there's no way for them to perceive what it means to live in a society that doesn't have those pressures.
True.
So the question is, how can I ask a transgender individual to imagine themselves not perceived in a society because they've they've grown up in a society where people perceive them? Is that the question?
Yes.
Interesting take.
Oh, I no. So that I don't think is a problem. I think you can envision yourself in a context where you won't be perceived by society any longer, at least. If you want to, like, so what I thought you were saying was what I would view more defensible, was that you would say something like, well, society, it may be the case that there's no longer pressure now from society, but this person grew up in a context where there was societal pressure, and that shifted their interests, that shifted their views, and that was wholly encompassing this.
I think that's what he's saying.
I am
that's
saying
what he's
that.
saying.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
That's what he's saying as well. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
If you are saying, so then there's just going to be some empirical underdetermination in that case. But it seems very okay. So you'd want to say like if there is just societal pressure. So do you think? Let me ask you this question then. Do you think that if we were to live in a society where no pressure is exerted,
that trans people wouldn't exist?
That trans people wouldn't exist. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I do
That's
believe
quite
True.
Yeah.
I agree. Great take, mind waves.
So I have. I guess we have different priors then. That's just different empirical priors that we have.
In what way?
Well,
No,
I
don't ask that. No, you should have said yes. We
Well,
do it. Let's end the
in what
conversation.
way?
Fuck.
You seem to have a high. You seem to have a high prior on that being true, and if I were to, and I have a lower prior on that being true. Like if we were to have society, I think trans people would exist if society.
Why though? Why would they exist?
No,
I don't
mind waves,
believe-
mind waves. Agree to disagree. I see where
Because I don't
Navi's coming from.
Yeah, because I don't see a reason to believe that the entirety of the causal chain of making someone feel suffering in virtue of a gender-sex mismatch is because of societal pressure. I certainly
I
grant
agree.
that that's a factor. I just don't see a reason to believe it's the only factor. Why do you believe it's the only factor?
Because I don't think that anybody can. Okay, well, first of all, I don't think that somebody can trans their gender in the sense that, like, I don't think that the reason that people want to transition is because there's that incongruency. The incongruency is caused
you
by
said the
the
word.
societal pressures that are
Just
put
the
on them.
repetition of the claim. Why do you believe it's wholly that? You're just repeating the claim again. So my question to you.
Guys, you've been repeating the same thing.
No. What I'm
for like
saying
an
is
hour.
that
My question to
if you take away what causes the incongruency, well, then there wouldn't be any incongruency, which
That's
means they
another
wouldn't need to
repetition.
transition.
You're already assuming the entire thing that causes the incongruency is societal pressure. Again, my question to you is not what do you think causes the entirety of the incongruency. My question to you is why do you think that societal pressure causes the entirety of the incongruency?
Because
answer
that is where gender exists, right? Gender is the
Oh,
societal
okay, so
pressure.
that's just you defining gender in terms of an incongruency by which
No.
it's caused by societal. Is that
I
what
am
you-
defining gender as the societal pressures put on the different sexes,
Okay, so
right?
Well, that's not.
You cannot
okay.
be transgender if there is no pressure, if there is no gender, right?
Yeah, so just to be
True,
clear,
let's abolish gender.
So just
I
to be
agree.
clear, the reason you believe the entirety of the causal chain of transgender people existing is because of societal pressure is because you've defined gender in such a way where there is where what that means to be transgender is just to have an incongruency caused by societal pressure. Did I get that right?
No.
Okay, then why do you believe
How
that?
how have you been talking for this long and you didn't get it right? Get it
Then
right
why
next
do
time,
you
Dipchat.
believe? Then why?
Okay, wait,
well,
also
if
real
you're
quick,
right, then how about
hold on,
tell me
you
why
guys
believe
can-
in the empirical. If it's not an analytic claim, then maybe it's an empirical claim. In which
Mind
case,
waves,
you
you
need to
get
provide
paid
me
to take this
evidence.
stream, by the way. You get
Excuse me.
paid to fucking make
Can
it
we-
resident sleeper.
Please, can we shut this guy up? Look,
Okay, hold on, wait, real quick.
I
Let's-
promise you, there's about 1,000 people that wish the same for you right
No,
now.
chill.
but-
Okay,
that's fine. I don't care.
Just so you guys, I have to, because I got shit I have to do tonight. You guys can continue on the conversation, but I have to dip. I'm sure Karantos and his stream will love it, but
if it's not analytic,
Destiny, you
if it's-
think I came in here to listen
not
to this
just-
shit?
all right,
Yep,
then
good luck.
I'll just mute you and I'll
You
talk
cunt,
over
you fuck you, you bitch! Give me my